Today, he finally escaped the tedious lectures of the Grand Tutor. How could he not be happy? Tell me, what's your name, and how old are you? Margaret Harrington asked gently. Imperial Aunt, my name is Lance Harrington, and I'm 6 years old. Imperial Uncle and everyone call me Lance. Imperial Aunt can call me Lance too. The boy's big, round eyes sparkled as he looked at her, utterly adorable. All right, Lance. Shall I take you to my place to play? Margaret Harrington smiled. Yes. Let's go. The boy replied cheerfully. So, Margaret Harrington took the boy's hand and walked towards Falling Lotus Pavilion. Edward Harrington watched their retreating figures, his gaze thoughtful. ### Chapter 27, Guests arrive at Falling Lotus Pavilion that afternoon. Edward Harrington escorted the Crown Prince back to the palace. As they were about to leave, the little boy clung tightly to Margaret Harrington's robe, refusing to let go. Finally, Margaret Harrington had to promise to visit the palace often, and only then did the boy release his grip and obediently return. Margaret Harrington watched the small figure turn back every few steps, her heart filled with fondness. She had always loved children, and Lance Harrington was a lively, intelligent, and mischievous boy whom she adored from the first glance. However, children in the palace were always different from other children. How long would the boy's innocence and carefree nature last? Lance Harrington was James Harrington's only son, his mother being the Queen. Only 6 years old this year, but intelligent, quick-witted, mischievous, and adorable, he was deeply loved by the Emperor. At the age of 4, he was appointed Crown Prince. 6 years old, truly the age of restlessness and playfulness, the boy loved to play and was also very eager to learn. Upon arriving at Falling Lotus Pavilion, he inquired about anything unfamiliar and even called the palace maids out to play hide-and-seek. Margaret Harrington was delighted. Being by his side, watching his innocent and adorable smile, all her worries vanished, leaving only serenity and joy in her heart. Lance hated studying, and Margaret Harrington thought that she must give him a copy of the Tri-Word Primer next time they met. This book was famously easy to understand, concise, and pleasant to read aloud, an excellent primer. But this dynasty didn't have it, she could write it herself. She vaguely remembered it. After the Crown Prince left, Margaret Harrington languidly stretched out on the chaise lounge placed in the courtyard, closing her eyes to rest. Since arriving in this ancient time, the thing she did most was lie on the chaise lounge in the courtyard, either reading, enjoying the cool breeze, admiring the scenery, or doing nothing at all. Far from the life of bloodshed, she was truly happy. Perhaps she should thank Edward Harrington. After all, this peaceful life was a gift from him. The ancient air was fresh and natural, without a trace of gasoline. The place was also very quiet, without the horns of cars, ships, or other modern transportation. Sitting in silence, it seemed as if her heart also became tranquil. No wonder the wealthy in modern times all wanted to return to a simple life. A life like this was truly peaceful. If possible, she really wanted to live like this forever. Peaceful and quiet, how wonderful. But it seemed that life was not hers to decide. There were many troubles, and even if you didn't seek them out, they would stick to you like molasses candy. Opening her eyes, she saw Lillian Moore standing beside her, her expression hesitant. Frowning slightly, she asked, "What is it?" "Miss." Lillian Moore thought for a moment, glanced around furtively, and lowered her voice. "Miss, I heard that another concubine has disappeared from Floating Cloud Pavilion without a trace, alive or dead. It's terrifying." "Again? Do people frequently disappear in the manor?" Margaret Harrington asked, frowning. "Yes. I heard a servant say that almost every month someone disappears from the manor for unknown reasons, and they are all women." Lillian Moore whispered. "Women?" For some reason, the image of the straw mat carried by the black-clad men last night flashed through her mind. Shaking her head, she said sternly, "Remember, don't look at what you shouldn't see, and don't say what you shouldn't say. Otherwise, you won't even know how you die. It was rare for her to give so many warnings. Although this girl wasn't quick-witted, she was completely loyal to her. She didn't want anything to happen to her. Yes, Miss, Lillian Moore replied, then asked, the gifts bestowed by the Emperor have been delivered by the prince's men. What should be done with them? Clear out a room next to the main room as a storeroom and put everything in there. Put the 2 jars of jade dew balm in my room. Yes, Mississippi. I'll go and tidy up right away. After saying that, she went to make arrangements. Lillian Moore was overjoyed with the Emperor's rewards. She had never seen such precious things. Miss was truly amazing. Closing her eyes to rest, she suddenly sensed an unusual presence approaching. Opening her eyes with alertness, she saw a man dressed entirely in black lightly land before her. Margaret, I heard you were injured, are you all right? As soon as he saw her, the newcomer asked anxiously, concern evident in his deep black eyes. Margaret Harrington was surprised. Godfather, why are you here? Indeed, this visitor was the godfather she had recently acknowledged in this world, the Shadow Gang leader, Victor Blackwell. Hey, stay seated. Be careful with your injury. Seeing her about to stand up, Victor Blackwell quickly stopped her. It's all right, it's just a small wound. Margaret Harrington stood up, pointed to the stone bench beside her, and said, Godfather, sit over there. So the two of them sat down together at the stone table under the large tree in the courtyard. Godfather, have some tea. She poured him a cup of tea. You're injured, where are you hurt, is it serious? Victor Blackwell accepted the teacup and asked. On my back. Just a small wound, it's nothing. Margaret Harrington said casually, then asked, Godfather, is your matter settled? Why are you here? Yes, that traitor has been dealt with, Margaret, don't worry. The story of you saving the crown prince and princess in the palace has spread everywhere, no one can believe it. I naturally knew you were injured, so I came to see. Seeing that you're all right, I'm relieved. Thank you for your concern, Godfather. Margaret Harrington's tone remained as indifferent as ever. But her heart was warm. But this Harrington Manor is no ordinary place. You being here, I'm not at ease. He frowned. Why? Edward Harrington is ruthless, cruel, and bloodthirsty, not a simple man. He has countless beauties, but he's heartless and treats women like discarded shoes. No woman who enters the manor has ever come out alive. I'm truly worried about you. Moreover, the defenses of this manor are extraordinary. I know you're Edward Harrington's princess consort, so I wanted to inquire about your news. But I've mobilized many Shadow Gang forces, and none could gather any information about the manor. It can be seen that this manor is not simple. The Shadow Gang couldn't even gather information about the manor. Margaret Harrington said in astonishment. One must know that the Shadow Gang had numerous talents and experts, with their ears and eyes spread throughout the Windcloud Empire. Yet they couldn't find out anything about the manor. Yes. Victor Blackwell nodded thoughtfully, it seems there's some mysterious force secretly protecting the manor. Margaret, your husband is not simple. I know that, Godfather, you don't need to worry. I was betrothed by the Empress Dowager, even if the prince doesn't like me, he absolutely wouldn't harm me openly, so please rest assured. Margaret Harrington comforted him. But it was also true, although Edward Harrington and the Empress Dowager weren't close, and the Empress Dowager even looked at him like an enemy, Margaret Harrington felt that Edward Harrington wouldn't openly confront the Empress Dowager. Otherwise, with Edward Harrington's violent nature, she probably wouldn't have survived 3 days. Margaret Harrington added, if the manor's defenses are so tight, isn't it dangerous for you to come here, Godfather? Although I don't know the exact details of the manor's background, entering and exiting it is a trivial matter for me. He chuckled casually. He took out a square brocade box from his chest and handed it to her. This is snow lotus from the heavenly mount region, a healing panacea with life-restoring properties. Take it, in case of emergencies. Godfather, I can't accept such a precious thing. She hastily refused. She had also experienced bloodshed and naturally knew how valuable this was. Sometimes, it was worth a life. That her godfather would give such a rare item to her showed how much he valued her. Obey, take it. Victor Blackwell's handsome face darkened, and he spoke sternly. But. No buts. This might be useful for you later. He spoke in a tone that brooked no argument. Margaret Harrington accepted it, feeling a touch of warmth in her heart. Margaret, I must go. If you encounter any difficulties, come find me at the welcoming guest pavilion in the city. Victor Blackwell instructed. Yes, I understand. Margaret Harrington replied. Knowing Edward Harrington's spies were everywhere, she didn't dare keep him any longer. Standing up to see him off, she added, Foster father, please stop investigating the royal mansion. I can handle everything here. She didn't want him to be put in danger because of this. All right then. Victor Blackwell considered for a moment, then agreed. He knew the woman before him was definitely not the timid, weak, and incompetent person as rumored. He believed she had the ability to protect herself within the royal mansion. I'm leaving now. If anything happens, just come find me. He gave his final instructions, then leaped into the air, disappearing like a gust of wind. Margaret Harrington was stunned. Her foster father's lightness skill was truly remarkable, far superior to that sky-born butterfly. It was a pity that even if her own skills were restored to their pre-transmigration level, she would still be worthless in front of these experts who could fly across rooftops. Sitting down, she felt a bit frustrated. How could she learn martial arts in this world? Night fell, and Margaret Harrington had just finished bathing when Edward Harrington arrived. Margaret Harrington was surprised. Shouldn't he be enjoying himself at the floating cloud pavilion at this hour? Why was he here? Your Highness, are you lost? Margaret Harrington said coldly as Edward Harrington entered. Edward Harrington's face immediately darkened. You are the royal consort I married through proper rituals. Shouldn't I be here? Margaret Harrington had just finished bathing, clad only in a thin silk nightgown that revealed her smooth, white skin. Her slightly damp long hair cascaded down to her waist, accentuating her snow-white, jade-like skin, making it impossible for anyone to look at her without feeling a flush of heat. Does your Highness not believe what I said? Margaret Harrington asked coldly as she wrapped her nightgown tightly around herself. Edward Harrington's handsome face darkened further. He actually believed her story about borrowing a body and returning soul to some extent. He wasn't a fool, anything could happen in this world, and such a thing wasn't impossible. But subconsciously, he still didn't want to believe it. It felt like if he did, he wouldn't be able to control her, and one day she would fly away, leaving him unable to find her. Do you have any reason for me to believe you? He stepped in front of her, looking down at her from above. The height difference made Margaret Harrington feel slightly pressured. She looked up at him coldly. One day you will believe me. Then I'll wait for that day to come. He smiled wickedly. But tonight, you are still my royal consort. With that, he pulled her into his arms and kissed her full, red lips. She couldn't help but murmur, are all men in the world the same? They forever love a woman's beauty and body, not the person she is. If a woman loses her beauty, men will discard her like worn-out shoes. Regardless of who they are all the same. The man on top of her froze, his movements coming to an abrupt halt. He had been paying close attention to her reactions, so every word she said reached his ears. The sadness, helplessness, and despair in her words immediately shocked him. That tone was so familiar. Like his own countless sighs. He looked up at her face. Her eyes were as cold as ice, filled with sadness and despair. Such complex eyes deeply shook him. What had this woman gone through to have such complex eyes? If he took this woman tonight, he would despise himself. He suddenly realized that this woman was truly special. Compared to her body, he desired her heart even more. Chapter 28, Soul-chasing loot. The sudden lightness made Margaret Harrington turn her head, looking at Edward Harrington questioningly. Edward Harrington breathed evenly, sighing softly with a hint of annoyance. You haven't fully recovered yet. I'll apply the medicine for you. Ignoring her probing gaze, he turned her over, revealing her scarred back. He got out of bed, retrieved the jar of Jade balm from the dressing table, and sat on the edge of the bed to apply it. The wounds had scabbed over, looking horrifying. He carefully poured the ointment from the jar and spread it evenly over the injuries. Looking at the wounds, Edward Harrington couldn't help but reproach, "You, why are you so stubborn? So badly injured, yet you didn't even make a sound. Don't you know how to beg?" Margaret Harrington was still somewhat disoriented. How had he become so gentle, applying medicine for her in the blink of an eye? This man, she truly couldn't predict him. She could never know what he would do next. She didn't speak because she didn't know what to say. Beg? What good would it do? Didn't this prince want to see her suffer? Now he was acting innocent. After applying the medicine, Edward Harrington dressed her in her nightgown, covering her tightly. Otherwise, he feared he wouldn't be able to resist wanting her. Seeing him about to get into bed, Margaret Harrington stopped him. "Your Highness, do you want to sleep here?" "Why not?" Edward Harrington glared at her, fiercely retorting. "There are many beauties waiting for you at Floating Cloud Pavilion. You should go there." Margaret Harrington said coldly, unafraid of death. "Is my beloved concubine jealous?" He suddenly smiled wickedly, his eyes burning as he looked at her. Jealous? Margaret Harrington sneered inwardly. This prince was too narcissistic. "Beloved concubine, don't forget, you are my woman." Seeing her disdainful expression, he became angry. He emphasized his words fiercely. Then he jumped onto the bed and forcefully pulled her into his arms. He became even more convinced of the soul transmigration. According to his investigation, Margaret Harrington, the timid, fearful woman who let others bully her, didn't have the guts to openly defy him. "Your Highness, why must you be like this?" Margaret Harrington sighed. "The women at Floating Cloud Pavilion are all gentle and can please you. Why must you get entangled with a porcupine? My beloved concubine needn't worry about me. I just want to taste what a porcupine tastes like." Edward Harrington said meaningfully. Porcupine. This appellation really suited her. "Your Highness. Say no more, sleep." Edward Harrington interrupted her impatiently, looking into her beautiful eyes, and said wickedly, "If my beloved concubine doesn't want to sleep, we can continue what we were doing earlier." Margaret Harrington remained silent. This man. Helplessly, she obediently closed her eyes and snuggled against him to sleep. In the late afternoon, the gentle sunlight enveloped the woman lazily reclining on the chaise lounge, casting a golden, holy, and beautiful light upon her. Edward Harrington stood at the entrance of Falling Lotus Pavilion, staring blankly at the woman bathed in golden light, a flicker of infatuation and suspicion in his eyes. After nearly a month of observation, he found her even more peculiar, making him countless times want to ask where she truly came from, why she was always such a mystery. But he didn't dare to ask, afraid the answer would be beyond his reach. He would rather believe that she was the foolish second miss chosen for him by his mother, the woman who would be his downfall. He wouldn't believe her claim of being a lost soul from another world. She was always cold, her eyes perpetually indifferent. As if she didn't care about anything. Even when he stood before her, kissed her, she didn't have him in her eyes. She loved to recline on the chaise lounge, like a lazy cat. Sometimes reading, sometimes doing nothing, just quietly gazing at the horizon. She was like an unsolvable riddle. Although she did nothing, she held a fatal attraction for him. Entering the courtyard, Margaret Harrington opened her eyes the moment he stepped through the gate. She looked at him with a hint of doubt. It had been almost a month since the night he nearly forced himself on her. To her surprise, Edward Harrington had rarely entered Falling Lotus Pavilion during this past month. But he often stood at the entrance, gazing at her with a deep look in his eyes. She truly didn't understand him, didn't know what he was thinking about her, why he acted so strangely. If she followed her own logic, she had rejected him, and this powerful, domineering prince, although temporarily letting her go, would certainly appear before her every day, and before long, would force himself on her regardless of her wishes. After all, she was his lawfully wedded princess consort and couldn't refuse his grace forever. But he did nothing. Her life remained the same, unchanged. He never summoned her, only occasionally appearing at the entrance of Falling Lotus Pavilion, but rarely entering. Sometimes he would enter, only to glance at her before turning and leaving, truly puzzling. Did he believe her words, believe she was no longer the same Margaret Harrington? But it didn't seem like it. If he believed her, why didn't he say anything? Everyone has curiosity, let alone the renowned Lord Harrington. If he truly believed her, why wouldn't he get to the bottom of it? Therefore, this man was very strange, she couldn't understand him. In this life and the last, there were very few people she couldn't understand, and Edward Harrington was one of them. Today, Edward Harrington wore a luxurious blue robe, his demeanor calm and restrained, unlike his previous coldness. His jet-black hair flowed down the sides of his handsome face, gently swaying with each step he took. The golden sunset light fell upon him, adding a brilliant halo to his tall figure, like a descended deity, incomparably handsome, exuding an innate noble aura. Margaret Harrington, looking at him like this, was momentarily stunned. Edward Harrington came before her, sat directly on the stone bench beside her, then looked at her and asked coldly, "Have you eaten yet?" Margaret Harrington came to her senses, looking back at Edward Harrington with an indifferent expression, inwardly cursing herself for actually having hallucinations. How could she feel that he was a deity descended from the ninth heaven? She unnaturally cleared her throat, then straightened up and said, "Not yet." "What brings your highness here?" Edward Harrington frowned and said, "Can't I come here if there's nothing specific, my beloved concubine?" He bit down hard on the words, beloved concubine, and Margaret Harrington naturally understood his meaning. She frowned slightly and said indifferently, "Your highness is naturally welcome to come. This Falling Lotus Pavilion is your territory." Hearing the disrespect in her words, Edward Harrington wasn't angry, but merely said coldly, "Good to know. I want to dine here." Margaret Harrington's usual dinner consisted of only 2 meat and 2 vegetable dishes, but today, because Edward Harrington was staying at Falling Lotus Pavilion for dinner, the table was laden with delicacies. Looking at the table full of food, her stomach rumbling with hunger, she ignored Edward Harrington across from her, picked up her chopsticks, and grabbed a chicken leg to gnaw on. It turned out that the prince's treatment was so good. It seemed she should keep him here for dinner more often. That way, she could also benefit. Looking at Margaret Harrington's crude eating manners, Edward Harrington frowned in displeasure and said, "Why are you eating so crudely? This isn't some back alley. You're acting like you haven't eaten in 8 lifetimes." Margaret Harrington rolled her eyes, very unladylike. "Your Highness's control is truly extensive. You're the one who wanted to eat here, not me dragging you here. Whether I'm crude or not, what does it have to do with you?" Edward Harrington's face immediately darkened, and he said coldly, "I truly underestimated you." "Really?" Margaret Harrington ignored him, finished gnawing on the chicken leg, and then picked up her chopsticks to eat the food on the table, saying as she ate, "Your Highness, I've already said, I'm no longer the same Margaret Harrington. Whether you believe it or not is your business, but don't use the rules of a noble lady to bind me." Edward Harrington watched her silently, his deep eyes looking at her with a complex expression. "Aren't you hungry, Your Highness?" Margaret Harrington asked. Edward Harrington withdrew his probing gaze, picked up his chopsticks with an impassive face, and picked at the food on the table that she had already ravaged. It must be said, Edward Harrington ate with remarkable grace, sitting upright, chewing thoroughly, and swallowing slowly, at least 100 times more refined than Margaret Harrington. Furthermore, he ate very little. By the time Margaret Harrington contentedly set down her chopsticks, he had already finished. Margaret Harrington dabbed her mouth with a napkin, then looked at Edward Harrington, saying, "Your Highness, what is it you wish to tell me? Please don't hesitate any longer, just tell me." Her perceptiveness brought a flicker of annoyance to Edward Harrington's handsome face. He said coldly, "It's nothing much, just informing you that tomorrow the Moonlight Empire's emissary will be visiting, and you must attend the banquet with me." Moonlight Empire? Margaret Harrington recalled what she knew. On this continent, there were 3 nations, the Moonlight Empire, the Windcloud Empire, and the Sunburst Empire. The 3 nations were of equal strength, their territories roughly the same size. But generally speaking, the Moonlight Empire was the most powerful of the 3, with the Windcloud Empire second and the Sunburst Empire last. Of the 3, the Moonlight Empire harbored the greatest ambition, always seeking to annex the other 2 and unify the world under its rule. But the other 2 were not easily bullied. Despite the Moonlight Empire's repeated provocations, it had gained nothing. She wondered what the Moonlight Empire's emissary's visit this time signified. Was it merely a friendly visit? As Margaret Harrington pondered, Edward Harrington continued, "I hear that the Moonlight Empire's emissary is bringing a rare treasure of the Moonlight Empire, the soul-chasing loot, and intends to find a worthy owner for it." Soul-chasing loot? What is that? And with so many people in the Moonlight Empire, and the loot being such a rare treasure, why would they come here to find an owner for it? Margaret Harrington asked, puzzled. You don't know. Although this loot is a divine weapon, no one has been able to control it for 1,000 years. It's said to be incredibly sentient, capable of spiritual communication with its owner. Moreover, its owner must be a woman, serene in heart, free from desires and ambitions. Only then can it be controlled. How strange, Margaret Harrington frowned. If it's a divine weapon, how can someone who desires nothing possess it? No wonder it hasn't found an owner for so many years. Indeed. The Moonlight Empire's emissary previously brought the soul-chasing loot to the Sunburst Empire. Countless people competed for it, but none could claim it, which is why they've come to the Windcloud Empire. Just how powerful is this loot that so many desire it? This loot is called the soul-chasing loot. It is said that it can capture souls in an instant, and even an army of thousands cannot withstand a single strike from it. Furthermore, the deeper one's inner strength, the greater its power, Edward Harrington explained, his gaze burning as he looked at her. So powerful. If she possessed it, wouldn't she no longer fear the martial arts experts here? Then, no matter where she was, she could live well, no longer so helpless. Thinking of this, she inadvertently met Edward Harrington's intense gaze. Startled, she felt a pang of guilt as if he had seen through her. Uncomfortably, she asked, "Why are you looking at me like that?" "I just want to know, does the princess have any interest in this soul-chasing loot?" Margaret Harrington frowned, understanding instantly. She said, "Your Highness is telling me this because you hope I will compete for the soul-chasing loot. But you must know, the second miss of the Harrington family is a fool who knows nothing. How could she have the ability to seize the loot? Didn't you say you are no longer the Margaret Harrington of before? Then you are naturally not a fool. Do you truly have no thoughts about the soul-chasing loot? No confidence in obtaining it?" Margaret Harrington looked into Edward Harrington's deep black eyes and asked suspiciously, "Why does your Highness want the soul-chasing loot?" Edward Harrington sighed softly. After a long pause, he said, "I don't want the soul-chasing loot, I simply don't want it to remain in the Moonlight Empire. It's rumored that the soul-chasing loot has the power to destroy the heavens and earth, and the Moonlight Empire, with its wolfish ambitions, has always coveted our territory and that of the Sunburst Empire. If someone from the Moonlight Empire were to control it, the world would surely be plunged into chaos. Peace has not come easily, and I don't want the people to fall into turmoil again. Margaret Harrington hadn't expected Edward Harrington to say such words. Everyone said he was cruel and bloodthirsty, treating human life like grass, but unexpectedly, he possessed a righteous heart, hoping for the people to live in peace and prosperity. For a prince wielding such power, such thoughts were truly rare. In this moment, her impression of him changed drastically, even developing a hint of admiration. Chapter 29, Charles Stone. Edward Harrington looked at her again and said, "The Moonlight Empire's visit with the soul-chasing zither is ostensibly to find a worthy owner for the instrument, but in reality, it's a display of their power and a probe into the strength of our Windcloud Empire. Therefore, I hope someone from our Windcloud Empire will obtain the soul-chasing zither and deflate their arrogance." Margaret Harrington asked, "Has your Highness ever fought against the Moonlight Empire?" She detected anger and resentment in Edward Harrington's tone towards the Moonlight Empire. Edward Harrington nodded, saying, 5 years ago, the Moonlight Empire brazenly provoked us, initiating a border war. Following my brother's orders, I led troops into battle, fighting for 2 years before repelling them. Afterward, a peace treaty was signed, sealed with a marriage alliance. Our Windcloud Empire's 16-year-old Princess Aurora was forced to marry the Moonlight Empire's emperor, a man over 50. As he spoke, Edward Harrington unconsciously clenched his fist, his dark eyes flashing with fury, indignation, and pain. Margaret Harrington sighed inwardly, guessing that the 16-year-old Princess Aurora must have been very close to him. Such a young woman becoming a pawn in a political marriage was truly regrettable. Not wanting Edward Harrington to continue in his anguish, Margaret Harrington quickly changed the subject. If so many have failed to obtain it, the soul-chasing zither must be incredibly difficult to acquire. I don't know martial arts and possess no inner strength. Why is your Highness so certain I can obtain it? Edward Harrington shook his head, speaking seriously. To be honest, I'm not certain. You claim to be from another world, and I'm 80% inclined to believe you. However, I haven't witnessed your abilities firsthand. My intuition tells me you're not ordinary. I simply hope you'll truly make me see you in a new light. At this banquet, all the talented women of our Windcloud Empire will be present. The final outcome depends entirely on you. From what your Highness says, this soul-chasing zither is powerful enough to cause chaos in the world. If I were to obtain it, aren't you worried I might have ill intentions and use it to unleash bloodshed? Edward Harrington looked at her, his gaze meeting her breathtakingly beautiful face. His tone remained indifferent, but his words caused Margaret Harrington's heart to tremble, bringing tears to her eyes. He said, "Although you appear cold, I believe you are kind. The soul-chasing zither in your hands will definitely not bring calamity to the world. Do you trust me that much?" She asked coldly, but a warmth spread through her heart. It had been so long since she had known what trust felt like. Unexpectedly, someone now spoke of trust in such a serious tone. The impact on her was unimaginable. "No, I trust my intuition," Edward Harrington said firmly, then added, "Prepare well tomorrow. We'll enter the palace together in the afternoon." After that, he stood and left her room, leaving her staring blankly at his tall figure. This man was worlds apart from the rumors. At noon, under the blazing sun, luxurious carriages arrived one after another at the majestic palace gates. Nobly dressed officials and their families stepped into the imperial city. From afar, an elegant light blue carriage approached slowly, its tasseled silk curtains swaying, wind chimes tinkling, and sheer veils fluttering, exuding a fresh and refined air. But the carriage was adorned with precious agate gemstones, sparkling brilliantly under the sun, radiating an air of extravagant luxury. Reaching the palace gates, this luxurious carriage, unlike the others, proceeded directly inside, standing out prominently amongst the crowd. However, the civil and military officials, upon seeing the carriage, respectfully stepped aside, bowing their heads as it passed. Inside the carriage were a man and a woman. The man wore a blue robe embroidered with a majestic four-clawed golden dragon in gold and silver thread, his entire being radiating an indescribable noble aura. His features were handsome, but his expression remained impassive as he leaned against the carriage wall, resting his eyes. The woman wore an elegant blue palace dress, her figure graceful, but her face was concealed by a white veil, making it difficult to discern her true appearance. Only her clear, bright eyes, tinged with a hint of coldness, were visible. The carriage's interior was spacious. She and the man, one leaning against the back wall, the other sitting by the window, maintained a distance. The woman lifted a corner of the window curtain, gazing at the bustling crowd outside, and couldn't help but speak, "Your Highness, you truly are special," entering the palace without even needing to alight from the carriage. "Your brother treats you exceptionally well." The man opened his eyes, glanced at her indifferently, said nothing, and closed his eyes again. Seeing this, the woman wasn't angered. Touching her veil, she said, "Actually, I don't need to wear this veil. It's fine to be as before. Why bother with such a fuss?" Hearing this, the man snorted softly, scoffing, "I'm afraid your unsightly appearance would frighten the court officials." The woman also snorted softly, retorting provocatively, "Your Highness, don't forget, that unsightly person is your princess consort." Suddenly, a strong gust of wind swept through, and the man gripped her chin, his deep black eyes piercing through the veil to meet her clear, cold gaze. He said coldly, "The princess consort is quite talkative. Why were you so silent before?" The woman raised her hand and brushed his hand away, saying with displeasure, "Before, I simply didn't want to cause trouble. Now that your Highness knows my identity, do I still need to endure everything?" The man's eyes darkened, then he sat beside her, his arm possessively encircling her waist. He declared domineeringly, "Your identity is my woman." The woman struggled briefly, then stopped when she realized she couldn't break free. Changing the subject, she asked, "Who are the envoys sent by the Moonlight Empire this time?" With the woman no longer struggling, the man's mood improved considerably. He replied, "It's Crown Prince Evan Grey of the Moonlight Empire, along with Grand General Trent Ray." The Crown Prince of the Moonlight Empire? She wondered what kind of person he was. As if anticipating her thoughts, the man said, "Evan Grey is accomplished in both literary and martial arts, with a shrewd mind. He's a talented individual, but ruthless and unscrupulous, making him a formidable opponent. Remember not to provoke him. Isn't he just like you?" The woman thought, rolling her eyes. The spacious main hall was filled with civil and military officials and the talented women they had brought along. The emperor's concubines had also arrived, only a few favored ones accompanying the emperor. At this moment, the hall buzzed with lively discussions about the main figures of the day, the Moonlight Empire's crown prince and the soul-chasing zither. Lord Harrington, Princess Consort Howe, have arrived. A eunuch's loud announcement silenced the hall instantly, hundreds of eyes turning towards the entrance. They watched the blue-robed man and woman slowly enter. The tall man, dressed in a luxurious blue robe, possessed strikingly handsome features, devoid of any smile. An aura of cold aloofness and unattainable nobility radiated from him, making it difficult to meet his gaze directly. Beside him, the woman in a splendid blue gown, her face veiled in white, possessed a graceful figure and charming demeanor, prompting imaginations of the breathtaking beauty hidden beneath the veil. The tall man and the petite woman, both in blue, truly appeared to be a match made in heaven. Perhaps some had previously mocked this couple due to the princess consort's supposed stupidity and ugliness. But ever since Margaret Harrington revealed her stunning beauty while saving the crown prince, no one dared to mock her appearance anymore. However, the truly talented and beautiful women still held her in disdain, their gazes filled with undisguised envy and contempt. What use is beauty? Stupidity remains stupidity, and a captivating appearance is merely a superficial facade. Those who had only heard of, but never met, Margaret Harrington were disappointed by her veiled face, some inwardly disbelieved, thinking her beauty exaggerated. Thus, the court held varied thoughts, their assessing gazes differing. Yet, the two involved remained unfazed, calmly taking their seats just below the Emperor, showcasing Edward Harrington's high status. Edward's presence silenced the hall's initial clamor, replaced by hushed whispers, demonstrating his considerable influence. Soon after they were seated, the Emperor, Empress, and their entourage arrived. The Emperor, clad in bright yellow dragon robes, was tall and handsome, a gentle smile gracing his face. Beside him, the Empress, in a red phoenix robe, exuded a regal air, her gentle face reflecting her maternal grace. She led young Prince Lance Harrington by the hand. Behind them were two favored concubines, Imperial concubine Elizabeth Harrington and noble concubine Livia Swift, both strikingly beautiful. Noble concubine Livia led a 5- or 6-year-old girl, the Princess Margaret Harrington had saved. The court rose, shouting, "Long live the Emperor," then sat obediently after being dismissed. The Emperor sat on the highest throne, the Empress beside him. Below them, to the left and right, sat Elizabeth Harrington and noble concubine Livia. Elizabeth sat below the Emperor, while noble concubine Livia and the Princess sat next to the Empress. Upon entering, Elizabeth Harrington glared at Margaret Harrington with provocation and resentment. Margaret, noticing, remained impassive, deeming such an arrogant woman unworthy of her attention. Once seated, Emperor James Harrington began a lengthy speech, declaring the Moonlight Empire's visit an honor for the Windcloud Empire, welcoming the Moonlight Empire's envoy, and so on. Bored by the proceedings, Margaret reached for a pastry, taking a bite. It melted in her mouth, undeniably delicious. She then poured herself a cup of wine from an exquisite flask. Edward Harrington merely glanced at her coldly, not hindering her actions. She took a sip. It was indeed fine wine, its fresh, elegant aroma spreading through her mouth, down to her lungs, and permeating her being. Suddenly, gasps and applause erupted, followed by a clear voice echoing through the hall. "Evan Gray of the Moonlight Empire greets the Emperor of the Windcloud Empire, wishing your nation favorable winds and rains, a peaceful and prosperous populace, and eternal peace and mutual progress between our nations." Like a thunderbolt, these words struck Margaret Harrington's heart. She looked up in astonishment, her wine cup clattering to the floor in the silent hall as she saw the handsome man in black robes standing amidst the court. The man, about 20 years old, wore vibrant red robes, exuding an aura of charm, wildness, and arrogance. His exquisite features seemed meticulously sculpted, his thick, sword-like eyebrows slightly raised towards his temples, his deep, dark eyes like a starlit night sky, bright and clear. Margaret Harrington trembled, her mind blank. This man, this face, she knew it by heart. Charles Stone. She tried to speak his name, but her voice caught in her throat. She could only stare through her veil at the face in the hall, intensely, in disbelief. How could they be so alike? As if cast from the same mold. The sound of the fallen cup drew everyone's attention. Edward Harrington immediately noticed her distress, drawing her into his embrace and addressing the Emperor. "Forgive me, Your Majesty, I accidentally dropped my cup." The Emperor replied indifferently, then turned to the envoy, saying gently, "I, too, hope for lasting friendship between our nations. Come, Prince Evan and esteemed envoys, please be seated." "Thank you, Your Majesty," Crown Prince Evan Gray of the Moonlight Empire replied with clasped hands, then led his entourage to their designated seats, directly opposite Edward and Margaret Harrington, separated by steps and an aisle. Evan Gray's gaze fell upon Edward Harrington, his expression darkening momentarily before returning to an amiable facade, a knowing smile playing on his lips. Yet, the depths of his eyes held a flicker of animosity, as if recognizing an enemy. Edward Harrington's face remained grim, devoid of any mirth, his eyes burning with suppressed anger. His arm tightened around Margaret Harrington. Nestled against Edward, Margaret turned away from the opposite side, her breath ragged, her heart pounding, which Edward easily perceived. He leaned close to her ear, whispering, "You best explain this to me clearly." His voice seethed with restrained fury. Margaret knew his anger but didn't respond, focusing on regaining her composure. She knew her reaction was a blunder, yet she couldn't help it. Charles Stone's appearance was too sudden, overwhelming her control. All her self-possession crumbled in Charles Stone's presence. Hashtag Chapter 30, Poetry Contest. She told herself, the man opposite was Crown Prince Evan Grey of the Moonlight Empire, not Charles Stone, just very much like him. Thinking that way, she calmed down. Then, she detached herself from Edward Harrington's embrace, sat up straight, and looked towards the opposite side. The man opposite had the exact same handsome features as Charles Stone, but the smile on his face was fake, completely different from Charles Stone's warm, sun-like smile. His eyes were deep and complex, revealing a gloomy and cold look, unlike Charles Stone's gentle expression. Margaret Harrington couldn't help but admit, despite the identical face, he wasn't him. Disappointment, bitterness, and sorrow welled up inside her, startling her. Hadn't she told herself she would never see him again? Why was she still hoping, still disappointed? She was truly incurable. Margaret Harrington heard him say to the Emperor, "This time, Evan Grey has come to your esteemed nation, bringing our country's treasured soul-chasing zither, hoping to find its rightful owner. I respectfully request your Majesty's assistance in this matter." "That is only natural." James Harrington's voice was gentle, yet carried the authority of an emperor. "I have heard that the soul-chasing zither is a world treasure, possessing immense power. To witness it with my own eyes today is truly a blessing for our Windcloud Empire. Your Majesty is too kind," Evan Grey said, then waved his hand. A guard beside him stepped forward, holding a zither covered in red silk in both hands. Seeing this, the eunuch beside the emperor quickly ordered a court lady to bring out a zither stand for the soul-chasing zither to be placed upon. The guard pulled down the red silk, revealing a jet-black, 7-stringed zither gleaming with silver. Precious rubies and luminous pearls adorned the zither, sparkling luxuriously, dazzling everyone present. This soul-chasing zither, strung with silk and adorned with rare treasures, is a divine weapon coveted by heroes throughout the land. It can instantly capture the souls of many, its power comparable to a vast army. However, only women can play the soul-chasing zither, and its power increases with the player's inner peace, tranquility, and detachment from worldly desires. Lady Manhwa, the founding empress of our Moonlight Empire, used this very soul-chasing zither to help the founding emperor conquer the lands that became the Moonlight Empire. But in the 500 years since Lady Manhwa, no one in the Moonlight Empire has been able to control it. My father believes that the soul-chasing zither, being a world treasure, should not be kept hidden away. Thus, he has commanded me to bring the soul-chasing zither on a tour of various nations, hoping to find its rightful owner. No one in the sun-chasing nation proved worthy. I hope your esteemed nation will not disappoint me." Evan Grey sat there explaining. Everyone could hear the boasting and provocation in his words. After all, the soul-chasing zither was not easily obtained. The emperor was slightly displeased by his provocation, but his face remained as amiable as before. He said, "If that is what the Crown Prince proposes, then let the talented women here compete. I and the Crown Prince will act as judges. I hope we will not disappoint the Crown Prince's expectations." He then addressed the women in the hall, "There is no need for nervousness. Simply display your talents freely. Whoever emerges victorious will become the owner of the soul-chasing zither. Do not disappoint the Crown Prince of the Moonlight Empire." This soul-chasing zither competition has 3 rounds: poetry composition, archery, and zither playing. The winner of the first 2 rounds gets to play the soul-chasing zither. Whoever can play it fluently becomes its owner. Every woman present, whether imperial concubine, princess, official's daughter, or commoner talent, has a chance to compete for the soul-chasing zither. Looking at the officials in the hall, each had several talented women beside them. As Edward Harrington said, His Majesty even selected 10 talented women from the common folk. It seems James Harrington is determined to keep the soul-chasing zither. Each contestant received a numbered card. Holding number 60, Margaret Harrington couldn't help but ask Edward Harrington, how many participants are there in total? Edward Harrington glanced at her card, his face impassive. Originally 59, now 60. Margaret Harrington's lips twitched. The man beside her added an infuriating remark, everyone knows my princess consort is an idiot, naturally, she wouldn't have a place. I added her in, so don't embarrass me. Margaret Harrington glared at him, then gazed at the radiant soul-chasing zither. She'd never seen such a beautiful zither, both elegant and imposing. She truly desired it. The first round was poetry composition. Crown Prince Evan Grey's requirement was a poem about chrysanthemums, elegant in imagery and profound in meaning, to advance. Quickly, they began with number 1. Writing about chrysanthemums wasn't difficult, the challenge was originality. The first few passed easily, but it became progressively harder. While 1 or 2 poems on the same topic were fine, dozens became repetitive. Furthermore, those later were influenced by earlier poems, becoming so tense they could barely think, let alone compose. As Margaret Harrington's turn approached, several contestants faltered, drawing sighs from the audience. Edward Harrington glanced at the woman beside him. Seeing her calm expression as she cheerfully snacked on refreshments, he couldn't help but want to laugh. This woman, all she did was eat. The 4 women before Margaret Harrington failed to compose a poem. When Seth Rollins, James Harrington's close eunuch, called number 60, the officials held no hope. The numbering was based on talent, with the Windcloud Empire's top talent, Selena Gomez, at number 1 and its top beauty, Cindy Peterson, at number 2. One could imagine the last contestant's skill level. When Margaret Harrington rose and slowly walked out, everyone was astonished. They hadn't expected the ignorant princess consort to participate. Many female contestants showed disdain. Her own sister, Elizabeth Harrington, spoke directly and unkindly. Second sister, you're competing too. You don't even know the simplest characters. What are you showing off for? Go back to your seat. Her words drew laughter, with someone echoing, indeed, princess consort, don't bother. You'll only embarrass yourself if you can't compose a poem. Indeed, your highness, you shouldn't be so stubborn. Our Windcloud Empire has no shortage of talented women, certainly not lacking a princess. Hearing the gossip, James Harrington glared at Elizabeth Harrington with an annoyed expression. This woman truly enjoyed stirring up trouble, regardless of the situation, utterly disgracing the Windcloud Empire. Meeting his glare, Elizabeth Harrington fearfully lowered her head, inwardly cursing Margaret Harrington. Evan Grey watched the veiled woman calmly step forward, a knowing smile playing on his lips. He had previously heard that Edward Harrington had married a woman both ugly and lacking in virtue and talent, and he had been secretly delighted. But then he heard that this woman was actually a breathtaking beauty, and he longed to see the face beneath the veil. Margaret Harrington ignored the whispers, standing confidently in the middle of the hall, her clear voice ringing out. First poem, yellow and red chrysanthemums adorn the garden, late autumn still cherishes the rich fragrance. I'd rather embrace the fading beauty on the branch, than follow the withered leaves falling with autumn. Second poem, autumn chrysanthemums stand proud amidst the frost, despite the harshness of wind and frost. Their resilient nature endures the icy grip, no wind or frost can shake them. Third poem, autumn chrysanthemums around the house resemble the old garden, surrounding the fence in the afternoon sun. It's not that among flowers I particularly love chrysanthemums, but because they bloom when all others have withered. The hall fell silent, everyone staring in astonishment, unable to believe what they had just heard. That fool could actually compose poetry, moreover, such extraordinary poems, and 3 at once, who would believe it? Margaret Harrington glanced indifferently at the astonished faces around her, scoffing inwardly. Composing poetry, she truly didn't know how. But after all, she was a transmigrator from a highly civilized modern era. If she couldn't compose, could she not recite? Poems describing chrysanthemums like this, she could recite 80 in one breath. What was so difficult? The 3 poems just now were chrysanthemum poems by the talented poetess Athena Storm of the Song dynasty, General Andrew Garfield and Miles Morales of the Tang dynasty, all poems she loved. It would be strange if these ancient people weren't astonished. A few claps rang out, followed by the Moonlight Empire's crowned Prince Evan Gray's praise, "Magnificent, magnificent. Your Highness is truly gifted in literature. Each poem is outstanding, the imagery profound. I'd rather embrace the fragrance on the aging branch, than follow the golden leaves dancing in the autumn wind. Inherently resistant to cold, no wind or frost can shake them. The image of the elegant, pure, and proud chrysanthemum amidst the wind and frost is depicted with exquisite detail. I am in awe." Seeing this, everyone in the hall echoed his praise, their hearts filled with astonishment. The women who had just mocked her were now ashamed and didn't know where to hide. Elizabeth Harrington's face became even uglier, staring at her with a mixture of shock and malice. Edward Harrington looked at his young wife standing serenely in the courtyard, his heart filled with emotion. He had been worried about whether she could produce a decent poem, but unexpectedly, her literary talent was so exceptional, instantly creating 3 poems with such profound meaning and majestic aura. It truly delighted him, and he wondered what surprises she would bring in the next competition. He was truly looking forward to it. Looking at the azure-clad woman whose face was veiled by a thin layer of chiffon, the corner of his lips curled up into a captivating smile. Margaret Harrington lifted her head, gazed at the face identical to the man she loved, momentarily stunned, then lowered her eyes and said, "Your Highness flatters me. May I ask if I have passed the round?" "That is a given. However, I've heard that the princess is not normally proficient in poetry and songs. I wonder how the princess could create such masterpieces." He voiced the question in his mind, his eyes flashing with a hint of suspicion. Upon hearing this, everyone in the hall widened their eyes, staring at Margaret Harrington, hoping to find the answer to how the foolish girl had transformed into a talented woman with such eloquent words. "Your Highness also said, I've heard. Sometimes, even witnessing something firsthand isn't necessarily the truth. How can your Highness so readily believe rumors?" Margaret Harrington said coldly. Evan Gray's eyes flickered, looking at the azure-clad, veiled woman in the hall with a teasing expression, and said with a laugh, "Then I was wrong. It seems rumors are unreliable." Margaret Harrington didn't reply, turning back to her seat, sitting down wearily, her heart in turmoil. How could she face this face, so like Charles Stone's? Just as she sat down, the expressionless man beside her pulled her into his arms, his strong arm tightly encircling her slender waist. He leaned close to her ear, his voice low and dangerous, "Do you know Evan Gray?" The soft body in his arms trembled, then relaxed. Edward Harrington's narrow eyes narrowed dangerously, sharp as a hawk's. He had noticed it early on. From the moment Evan Gray entered, her behavior had been unusual, not only dropping her wine cup but also constantly staring at him in a daze. He was certain she knew him, and their relationship was far from ordinary. This made him incredibly irritated. His woman was staring at another man, and it was the man he hated to the core, the one he could never forgive. Sensing the cold, gloomy aura emanating from the man beside her, like 10,000-year-old ice, incredibly dangerous, Margaret Harrington felt a sudden, inexplicable fear. She denied, "I don't know him." "Is that so?" he replied indifferently, his tone without a ripple, only his deep, sharp eyes narrowed slightly, flashing with a dangerous glint. Clearly, he didn't believe her words at all. "Whether you believe it or not is up to you," she said coldly, then hesitated, adding in a low voice, "But, that face, I find it very familiar." The words escaped her lips, her heart aching, incredibly uncomfortable. Edward Harrington paused, looking up at Evan Gray's face across from them, only to see the corner of his mouth twitching upwards in a smirk, watching the two of them. Scowling darkly at him, he then withdrew his gaze, his arm tightening around Margaret Harrington's waist. He leaned close to her ear, warning, "I don't care whether you know him or not, but don't provoke him again." Evan Gray was his enemy. Many of his sworn brothers had died at his hands. Even though their two countries had signed a peace treaty, he still wanted to tear him to shreds. Margaret Harrington looked up across the hall, seeing the man who so resembled Charles Stone addressing the Emperor about the commencement of the second round. His voice, his mannerisms, everything was exactly like Charles Stone. This caused her heart to ache with an unbearable pang. Why is it like this? Are you Charles Stone? Do you even recognize me? Noticing the woman in his arms staring intently across the room, Edward Harrington's face paled. His large hand tightened around her waist, digging into her soft flesh. Margaret Harrington gasped in pain, jolted back to awareness. She glared at the culprit, but when she met his dark gaze, she froze, slowly recalling his earlier warning. "I won't provoke him," she murmured, trying to suppress the bitterness welling up inside. In this lifetime, she wanted nothing more than to avoid that face, to avoid provoking the man standing opposite them. Because she wasn't worthy. Charles Stone, cultured and gentle, with a smile like sunshine, how could he possibly belong to her, a cold-blooded assassin? Chapter 31, Archery. She took a deep breath and turned her attention to the woman practicing archery in the Great Hall. In the spacious hall, not far from the entrance, stood a target. 10 meters away, a woman in green attire held a bow, drawing the string taut in aiming. Tall and beautiful, with a hint of heroic spirit between her brows, she held the bow drawn like a full moon, her posture tilted forward enticingly, captivating everyone in the hall. With a whoosh, the arrow left the bowstring, flying straight into the red heart of the target. Thunderous applause erupted in the hall, mingled with the excited praises of the court officials. Worthy of being the #1 talent of the Windcloud Empire, proficient in both literature and martial arts. Like father, like daughter. Miss Shen, daughter of General Shen, your archery skills are truly astonishing. A true talent. So, she was Selena Gomez, the Windcloud Empire's most celebrated talent. Margaret Harrington hadn't realized her father was a general. Watching her, Margaret sensed a quiet confidence, a regal air. She wasn't a breathtaking beauty, but she possessed a unique allure. But was such excessive flattery necessary? Glancing at the enthusiastic crowd in the hall, Margaret Harrington frowned slightly. Only 10 meters. The challenge was hardly impressive. Still, she understood the stark gender divide in the Windcloud Empire. Men trained for war, defended their homeland, while women remained largely confined to their homes. Only daughters of noble or influential families received an education, learned to read and write, and practiced basic self-defense. Therefore, such archery skill was indeed commendable. The woman in green finished her demonstration flawlessly. She bowed before the assembled court, her demeanor natural, her smile gentle, exuding refined grace. However, as she raised her head, her gaze swept seemingly unintentionally towards Edward Harrington. Upon seeing the two of them together, a flicker of sadness and loneliness crossed her eyes before she quickly looked away. It was just a fleeting glance, but Margaret Harrington's sharp senses caught it. It seems this Windcloud Empire's top talent has unusual feelings for the man beside her. However, right now, she didn't have the mental space to worry about what this talented woman thought of her husband. The immediate, pressing matter was another incredibly difficult problem. She didn't know how to shoot a bow. She'd never even touched a bow and arrow. In the 21st century, she used high-tech weaponry and never imagined having to use a bow and arrow. This outdated weapon had been obsolete for hundreds of years. But today, she had to use it to overcome the challenge and win what she desired. Her shooting skills were impeccable, hitting the bullseye every time. But archery? Honestly, she wasn't sure at all. This archery challenge truly stumped all the women in the hall. Normally, they only studied the refined arts of music, chess, calligraphy, and painting, completely unrelated to wielding swords or shooting bows. So, as soon as the second round began, they were flustered, silently blaming the emperor for deliberately making things difficult. Actually, James Harrington couldn't be blamed for this. This round was decided by the crown prince of the Moonlight Empire. Even as the king of a nation, he had no other choice. The Moonlight Empire valued martial arts. Both men and women had to know how to ride horses and shoot bows, so this round wasn't a challenge at all for the Moonlight Empire's women. But Windcloud Empire was different. The women here were inherently delicate, so overcoming this round was truly as difficult as ascending to heaven. Thanks to James Harrington's negotiation, Evan Gray agreed to reduce the distance to 10 meters, not even requiring them to leave the main hall. But this challenge still posed a problem for the talented women of Windcloud Empire. More than 20 beauties who passed the first round dejectedly left the arena after being eliminated. Even the arrogant Elizabeth Harrington missed the target completely and had to shamefully return to her seat. Watching the beauties fail, Edward Harrington frowned slightly, not very pleased. Perhaps he should ask his brother to issue a decree encouraging the women of Windcloud Empire to learn martial arts and practice archery. "Do you know how to shoot a bow?" he asked. "No," Margaret Harrington replied calmly. "Do you know how to play any instruments?" "A little." She had some experience with the guqin, but wasn't proficient, only knowing a few simple pieces. Hearing this, Edward Harrington's face darkened, and he said nothing more. He just silently watched the women competing in the hall, his thoughts unclear. When Margaret Harrington was the last to step up to compete, many immediately sneered and scorned. Elizabeth Harrington, for example, her eyes filled with mockery, just waiting to see her lose face. The first round could be considered a fluke, but this second round required real skill. How could a sheltered lady who had never stepped foot outside her home know how to shoot a bow? It would only make her a laughingstock. However, there were also quite a few people looking forward to her performance, such as the emperor sitting high above. In the first round, her 3 exquisite poems about chrysanthemums had astonished everyone. They began to vaguely sense that this rumored fool of a princess might actually be biding her time. Who knew, she might just overcome this challenge. Margaret Harrington calmly stepped onto the arena. Her face, behind the veil, revealed no expression. She reached out to receive the bow and arrow offered by the eunuch, carefully observing them. The bow was exquisite, but quite heavy and had good elasticity. The arrow was also beautiful, its tip gleaming, the feathers at the tail crafted with skill. "Is this an ancient bow?" She held it, a strange feeling coursing through her. Taking an arrow, she mimicked the motions of those before her, attempting to knock it to the string. But she quickly realized it wasn't so simple. Her grip was wrong, preventing the arrow from fitting. Those around her, witnessing her clumsiness, shook their heads in disappointment. Clearly, this royal consort knew nothing of archery. Does the royal consort not know how to shoot? A smooth, clear voice echoed. Margaret Harrington turned slightly, finding Evan Gray, Crown Prince of the Moonlight Empire, watching her with amusement. His deep gaze, coupled with a faint smirk, seemed to carry a hint of mockery. That calculating smile irritated her. Charles Stone was always bright and sincere, his smile radiant and pure. This man, despite sharing Charles Stone's face, was a schemer. He tainted that handsome, scholarly visage. She truly loathed him. "So," she retorted coldly, "did I say I knew how?" Gasps filled the hall. No one expected Margaret Harrington to so brazenly, so disrespectfully, rebuff Evan Gray. The court officials immediately regarded her with disdain, thinking, this royal consort truly lacks breeding. Edward Harrington, seated above, narrowed his eyes, a storm brewing within them. She wasn't one to be impulsive, why such a strong reaction to his words? Even Evan Gray was momentarily taken aback by the royal consort's fiery temper. But it intrigued him. Maintaining his composure, he said gently, "Don't overthink it, royal consort. I merely asked out of concern. Whether you know archery or not, hitting the bullseye completes the trial." Margaret Harrington said nothing, only glancing coldly at him before turning back, picking up the bow, drawing the string, and aiming at the target 10 meters away. The court officials sighed in regret. With her awkward knocking, how could she possibly hit the mark? A whooshing sound split the air as the arrow flew. All eyes were fixed on the target. There, in the bullseye, an arrow was lodged, askew yet undeniably centered. Half its length was buried deep. This was pure luck. Even a haphazard shot could hit the bullseye. The court officials shook their heads in disbelief. But some keen-eyed military officials noticed something unusual. The stance was wrong, yet the arrow struck true, embedded deeply. This couldn't be mere luck. Edward Harrington looked at the woman in blue, his gaze complex. Was this woman a treasure bestowed by heaven, or the bane of his existence? Emperor James Harrington stared at her with astonishment and suspicion. This woman was entirely different from what he had investigated. What was going on? Evan Gray, his gaze deep, watched her intently. He realized this woman was genuinely intriguing. Her calm, composed demeanor, neither arrogant nor self-deprecating, exuded an ethereal grace. Compared to the rumors of a foolish princess, she was as different as night and day. Initially, he intended to use her to mock the arrogant Hao Wang, but unexpectedly, it seemed he had stumbled upon a treasure. This thought made Evan Gray extremely uncomfortable. "Congratulations, princess, on passing the challenge," he said, a bright smile on his lips, but his eyes remained cold and emotionless. "Thank you." Her tone still cold and distant, Margaret Harrington turned and walked towards her seat. Her graceful back, with an air of unburdened freedom, stirred something within Evan Gray. Round 2 has concluded, so let's proceed to round 3. Prince Evan Gray, what are your thoughts? The clear and warm voice of Emperor James Harrington rang out, a gentle smile gracing his handsome face, yet maintaining the majesty of an emperor. "As your majesty wishes," Evan Gray replied. In the center of the great hall, a gleaming soul-chasing zither was placed ceremoniously. Behind the zither, 4 women in splendid attire stood in a neat row. The woman standing on the far left wore a green dress. She was tall, with delicately drawn eyebrows, eyes as clear as autumn water, and lips as red as peach blossoms. Her youthful appearance, dignified and serene demeanor, and the hint of heroic spirit between her brows accentuated her exceptional presence. She was the foremost talented woman of the Wind-Cloud Empire, Selena Gomez. The second woman was a captivating beauty, impossible to ignore. Her eyes sparkled like black jewels, framed by thick, curved lashes, a delicate nose, and cherry-red lips, brimming with vitality. Her graceful, alluring figure resembled a celestial fairy descended to the mortal realm, breathtakingly beautiful. She was the most beautiful woman in the Wind-Cloud Empire, Cindy Peterson. The third woman wore yellow, her beauty average, her features delicate, but her large, round eyes sparkled with a mischievous, endearing charm, making her unforgettable from the first encounter. She was the daughter of the Minister of War, Jessica Ray. The last woman was the unexpected enigma of the competition. Clad entirely in blue, her face concealed by a veil, no one could discern her features. Yet, her posture and emanating aura conveyed a sense of calmness, profound inner strength, and an extraordinary presence that could not be overlooked. She was the one they called the foolish princess, Margaret Harrington. Now, you may attempt to play the soul-chasing zither. Whoever can control it will become its master. But I, the prince, must warn you, to control this zither requires profound inner strength or a truly tranquil soul. Otherwise, the zither will resist and cause harm. Be careful. Prince Evan Grey issued his caution. Everyone present was astonished. Is the soul-chasing zither truly that miraculous? Behind the zither, some were anxious, some excited, some calm as a still lake, others impassive. Margaret Harrington, gazing at the instrument, wore a look of wonder. She questioned whether the zither possessed a spirit, capable of resonating with the player's soul. The first to step forward was Selena Gomez, clad in green, her face brimming with confidence. Skilled in martial arts and possessing inner strength, she felt she held an advantage. Taking a deep breath, she placed her slender, white hand upon the strings of the soul-chasing zither. All eyes in the hall were fixed upon her. The first note rang out, clear and resonant. A faint smile touched Selena Gomez's lips, and those around her nodded in approval. But when she plucked the strings a second time, no sound emerged. Panic rising, Selena Gomez channeled her inner strength, striving to coax a melody from the instrument. After much effort, only a faint, choked sound escaped, then silence. Sweat beaded on her brow. Glancing around, she saw others watching with worry or mocking laughter. Enraged, she focused her energy and forcefully struck the strings. Suddenly, a silver streak of sword energy erupted from the zither, hurtling toward Selena Gomez. Unable to react, she was flung back, crashing to the ground. A mouthful of blood sprayed from her lips, staining them crimson. The hall erupted in shock. Selena Gomez's mother screamed, "Selena," and rushed to her daughter's side. "Someone quickly assist Lady Selena and get her medical attention." Emperor James Harrington commanded urgently. Several court ladies immediately rushed forward to help the near-unconscious Selena Gomez from the hall. Margaret Harrington, watching the green-clad girl coughing blood, then glancing at the soul-chasing zither, couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. Truly, this was no ordinary object, not easily mastered. Even Selena Gomez, with her inner strength, couldn't withstand its power. What hope did she, Margaret, have without such strength? Was her spirit truly serene enough to conquer it? Looking up at Evan Grey, she saw his faint smile remained, his eyes betraying no surprise at Selena Gomez's injury. Clearly, he had anticipated this outcome. Turning to Edward Harrington, she noted his impassive face, his brow furrowed. Emperor James Harrington's usually amiable expression was now etched with worry and deep thought. It seemed the soul-chasing zither had delivered quite a shock. The second to approach was the renowned beauty, Cindy Peterson. But now, her initial confidence had vanished, replaced by stark terror. Selena Gomez's fate had clearly shaken her. She frowned slightly, sitting down hesitantly on the bench before the zither, her trembling form evoking pity. At that moment, the surface of the soul-chasing zither seemed to shimmer with a faint white mist, enveloping the instrument in an eerie glow. The beauty extended a slender finger towards the strings. But upon contact, she cried out in pain, recoiling sharply and clutching her injured finger with her other hand. Her beautiful face was contorted in agony. Everyone stared in astonishment at her hand. Her left hand tightly gripped her right, crimson droplets welling up between her stark white fingers. The soul-chasing zither's strings had sliced through her fingers. "Go and have that bandaged," Emperor James Harrington sighed, his gentle face etched with helplessness. "Thank you, Your Majesty," the beauty murmured, bowing in gratitude through the pain as a court lady helped her withdraw. Chapter 32, A Melody That Topples Kingdoms. Oh, the soul-chasing zither is so scary. Do I really have to play it? The young woman in yellow beside Margaret Harrington leaned closer, her voice a hushed whisper. Margaret Harrington, taken aback by the girl's childish yet witty remark, turned to look at her. The girl's lively eyes held a look of such innocent vulnerability. "I don't want anything to do with the soul-chasing zither. Father forced me to come here," she whispered, her brows furrowed in a picture of utter dejection. Margaret Harrington couldn't help but smile. What an adorable girl. Barely 14 or 15, and already forced to participate in this competition, how pitiful. Don't worry. If you truly can't play it, then don't. Just be careful not to hurt yourself, she murmured, a genuine fondness blooming for this naive young girl. I really don't have to play? Yes. The young woman in yellow sat before the soul-chasing zither. Instead of playing immediately, her curious eyes carefully examined the mystical instrument. Glancing at her father, she saw his loving gaze filled with concern, a warmth spreading through her chest. Then, she reached out and touched the strings. All eyes in the hall were fixed on her, a mixture of worry, anticipation, and morbid curiosity. Margaret Harrington, too, felt a pang of anxiety for the girl. The soul-chasing zither was the Moonlight Empire's most treasured possession, not something they would readily display. Its presentation to other nations suggested absolute confidence that no one could master it. Lost in thought, she was startled by a clear, resonant note. Looking towards the young woman in yellow, she saw a calm expression as two more melodious notes followed. A ripple of excitement spread through the crowd. But then, the girl's brow furrowed, the strings felt impossibly heavy, resisting further touch. Disappointment rippled through the hall, heads shaking in silent dismay. Instead of persisting, the young woman in yellow rose gracefully and addressed Emperor Evan Grey, bowing low, the soul-chasing zither is truly a divine instrument. However, this humble servant lacks the skill to wield such a treasure. I am deeply honored to have witnessed its magnificence today. Lady Ray, your magnanimity is truly admirable, Evan Grey commended. You are too kind, Your Highness, she replied politely. 3 notes are already a remarkable feat. You may retire, Emperor James Harrington said gently. Thank you, Your Majesty. With a final curtsy, she returned to her seat. Margaret Harrington raised an eyebrow, surprised. Beneath the naive and lively exterior, this young girl possessed remarkable poise. Her respectful demeanor before royalty, devoid of arrogance or flattery, spoke of true refinement. Margaret Harrington found herself looking at her with newfound respect. Princess Consort, how, you're the only one left who hasn't played the soul-chasing zither. Do your best. I don't want to bring it back untouched. The women of both countries have failed to awaken the zither. My father will think I'm useless. Evan Grey looked at her, half smiling. Everyone from the Wind Cloud Empire in the hall felt a surge of resentment. What did he mean by that? Was he insulting the Wind Cloud Empire for lacking talented women? Your Highness, the soul-chasing zither is a divine artifact. Naturally, it's not something ordinary people can possess. Even with the abundance of talented women in your Moonlight Empire, none could control it. Otherwise, you wouldn't have traveled thousands of miles to our country. Rest assured, Your Highness, I will do my best. Whether the soul-chasing zither chooses me or not is its own affair. Margaret Harrington, also displeased with his words, retorted without hesitation. Her cold tone and sharp words were met with satisfaction by everyone in the hall. Edward Harrington's lips curved slightly upwards, pleased with her quick wit. Evan Grey's eyes deepened, a hint of amusement playing on his lips. Then, if you please, Princess Consort. Without further ado, Margaret Harrington walked to the soul-chasing lute and sat down. She carefully examined the world-renowned instrument, observing the silver aura swirling around it like an elusive mist. Before arriving, she was determined to obtain it. Having it would provide an extra layer of security in this world. But now, seeing its radiant glow, she reconsidered. Destiny is predetermined, why force it? In her past life, she didn't believe in fate, only in herself. She never gave up on what she wanted, striving to reach the top of the assassin rankings and clinging to the fragile love between her and Charles Stone. But what was the result? Even becoming the top assassin only added to her karmic debts. A life of blades wasn't what she desired. She loved a man, willing to give up everything for him, only to be met with a painful death. Why bother? Let things flow naturally. What's meant to be will be. Heaven had granted her a second chance, and she wouldn't repeat her past mistakes. She would embrace the natural order, not chase after what wasn't hers. Her slender, white fingers touched the strings, gently plucking one. A clear, pleasant note resonated. It truly was a fine instrument. Everyone from the Wind Cloud Empire in the hall watched the blue-robed woman sitting serenely in the center, hoping for a miracle that would bring glory to their empire. Margaret Harrington's hands moved across the strings with fluid grace and strength. A light, melodious tune filled the vast hall, enchanting and moving all who heard it. Margaret Harrington's clear, melodious voice, blending with the music, echoed through the hall. A beautiful melody flowed from her gently parted lips. Mortal world, full of laughter, infatuation, so tiresome, detachment brings contentment, this life, still unfinished, I harbor no worries, I only wish for a half-life of carefree ease. Awake, I laugh with you, in dreams, all is forgotten, lamenting how quickly night descends, the next life is unpredictable, love and hate erased with a single stroke, drinking and singing, I only wish for joy until old age. I don't know why I chose this melody, perhaps it's a feeling I'm expressing. Struggling in this mortal world, with schemes and plots, vying and fighting, I'm truly tired, bored, and weary. I just want to get drunk, forget all the right and wrong, and trade it for a half-life of carefree ease. Though the wind is cold, I don't want to hide, though flowers are beautiful, I don't care, let me drift, the higher the sky, the smaller my heart, I don't ask about karma, drunk and alone, today I cry, tomorrow I laugh, I don't seek understanding, proud and alone, singing and dancing in a frenzy, the long night stretches on, unaware of dawn, searching for joy. Everyone in the great hall listened, captivated, staring at the azure figure in the center, both incredulous and overjoyed. The graceful azure figure sat in the middle of the great hall, her whole body radiating a noble, ethereal aura, like a high-ranking celestial being, unreachable. She was like a luminous object, though her face couldn't be clearly seen, she undeniably became the focal point of the entire hall. I really want to see her face, it must be beautiful. This was the shared thought of everyone present. As if answering everyone's silent prayer, a sudden gust of wind swept into the great hall, lifting the veil covering the azure-clad woman's face. In an instant, a breathtakingly beautiful face was revealed. Delicate willow-leaf eyebrows, enchanting elongated phoenix eyes, a small, straight nose, cherry lips slightly pursed, white teeth and rosy lips, a small face with a delicate rosy hue, like a gentle spring breeze, like a tranquil lotus flower. Her eyes were clear as water, yet sparkling like a star-filled night sky. She possessed an ethereal beauty, serene as still water, the corners of her lips curving into a faint smile. A gentle light radiated from her, like a celestial being untouched by earthly dust, captivating all who beheld her. Everyone, regardless of gender, gazed at her stunning face, breathless. Her beauty was different from the glamorous beauty of Cindy Peterson, the first beauty. Hers was an ethereal, otherworldly beauty, lofty and remote, even more captivating than Cindy Peterson's alluring charm. The wind shifted, the veil fell. That breathtaking face, like a night blooming Sirius, was etched into everyone's hearts. Mortal life is full of laughter, obsession is truly tedious, to have nothing is also fine, this life is still unfinished, I am not burdened, I only wish for a half-life of carefree ease. When awake, I laugh with you, in dreams, all is forgotten, lamenting how quickly night descends, next life's a mystery, love and hate erased in a single stroke. Drinking and singing together, I only wish for joy until old age. The ethereal melody echoed throughout the grand hall, and in everyone's eyes, only the serene figure of the azure-clad woman remained, all else fading into nothingness. A city-toppling tune, captivating whose eyes, stirring whose heart. The music ceased, and Margaret Harrington withdrew her hands, calmly gazing at the soul-chasing zither before her. Truly a magnificent instrument, yet it allowed someone as mediocre as her to play it so fluently and movingly, further immersing her in the lingering melody. Now she felt a sense of ease, as if all her troubles had vanished, leaving a pleasant tranquility. If she could play it, did that mean she could control it, become its master? At this thought, she looked up joyfully towards Crown Prince Evan Grey of the Moonlight Empire. Only then did she realize something was amiss. Why was the great hall so silent? Through her veil, she saw everyone staring at her, as if petrified. What was going on? Was everyone bewitched? She looked questioningly at Edward Harrington, finding him gazing intently at her, a light she couldn't comprehend gleaming in his deep eyes. Glancing at Evan Grey, she saw him also looking at her with a burning gaze, a possessive look that startled her. Looking up at Emperor James Harrington, she saw a hint of infatuation on his usually amiable face. The others were the same, all staring at her with captivated eyes. It's over. Could it be that the soul-chasing zither had stolen everyone's souls? She quickly stood up and said in a loud voice, "Your Majesty, Your Highness, what do you think of my performance? Does this soul-chasing zither belong to me?" As soon as she finished speaking, everyone in the hall seemed to snap out of it, but their eyes still lingered on her. Princess Howe's piece was truly magnificent. What does Crown Prince Evan Grey think? James Harrington feigned a cough, masking his lapse in composure, and spoke gently. Such music should only exist in the heavens, mortals rarely have the chance to hear it. Evan Grey praised. I never expected Princess Howe's musical skill to be so divine. Rumors truly cannot be trusted. Margaret Harrington lowered her head without speaking. Murmurs rippled through the hall, lamenting how harmful rumors could be. How could such a beautiful and graceful woman, a true beauty capable of toppling nations, be rumored to be ignorant and ugly? Everyone has witnessed that the princess can control the soul-chasing zither. This instrument naturally belongs to her. I am also delighted to have found its owner. It seems my visit to the Windcloud Empire was timely. The Crown Prince looked at Margaret Harrington and smiled. Thank you, Your Highness, Margaret Harrington replied coldly, lowering her head. She then picked up the soul-chasing zither from the table and prepared to leave. Imperial Aunt. At that moment, a clear, childish voice suddenly rang out in the quiet hall, followed by a small, golden figure running down. Imperial Aunt, why are you covering your face? Lance can't see you. The little prince ran to her side, tugged at her robe, and tilted his innocent little face to ask. Everyone in the great hall curiously watched Margaret Harrington, eager to hear her response. Margaret Harrington, looking at the adorable boy, a faint smile unconsciously graced her lips. She gestured for the maid Lillian Moore to come forward and handed her the soul-chasing zither. Then, bending down, she took the little prince's hand and led him towards their seats. As they walked, the boy explained, it was your royal uncle's instruction. He said you were ugly and would frighten everyone in the great hall. Ah, the boy exclaimed in surprise. All eyes in the great hall turned towards Edward Harrington, who sat stiffly. His face darkened immediately. Seeing Lord Harrington's grim expression and sharp gaze, the crowd fearfully averted their eyes, lowering their heads and daring not to look again. They wouldn't dare provoke this prince, who resembled the king of hell. Margaret Harrington led the little prince to their seats. He immediately tugged on Edward Harrington's robe, exclaiming, Royal uncle, my royal aunt isn't ugly at all. She's as beautiful as a fairy, the most beautiful person Lance has ever seen. Doesn't royal uncle think she's beautiful? Edward Harrington's face darkened further, his lips pressed tightly together. The others, a mixture of curiosity and fear, surreptitiously observed Lord Harrington's reaction. The Emperor bit back a smile, eager to hear his brother's reply. Opposite them, Evan Grey watched with an enigmatic smile, his eyes holding a deep amusement. Seeing Edward Harrington's silence, the little prince, unafraid, persisted, Royal uncle, say something. Isn't royal aunt beautiful? Margaret Harrington froze. She had only meant to appease the child, but Lance was surprisingly persistent. She glanced at Edward Harrington's face, pale and dangerous. She quickly pulled Lance away, saying, "Lance, stop it. If you continue, your aunt will be angry." "Lance, it's enough that you know." "You don't need to keep saying it," Margaret Harrington said, exasperated by his persistence. "Oh, Lance understands. I won't call Royal Aunt a beauty anymore." "I know," the boy said seriously, nodding obediently. Evan Gray, unable to contain himself, burst out laughing. Chapter 33 Lies. Looking up, Evan Gray's smile widened, his seductive eyes fixed on her, causing her to flusteredly look away. She then noticed the Emperor also stifling a laugh, his gentle features slightly distorted. Reactions varied throughout the hall, while beside her, Edward Harrington shot her a "you're an idiot" look. Thinking about what she had just said, Margaret Harrington felt her face, hidden beneath the veil, flush. She had been a bit immodest. Sigh, it was all this boy's fault. Emperor James Harrington then declared the soul-chasing zither competition officially over, with the princess consort of Hao having won the zither. The welcoming banquet for the Moonlight Empire's envoy officially began. With music, dancing, food, toasts, and conversation, the banquet reached its peak. Margaret Harrington, however, felt a distinct lack of enthusiasm. She constantly felt a burning gaze fixed upon her, making her extremely uncomfortable. Fortunately, the presence of little Prince Lance Harrington, with his chatter and laughter, prevented her from appearing too unusual. The little prince even pulled the little princess over, who was adorable but quite shy. The two children played by her side for a while before returning to their parents. She sat there, flanked by the imposing Edward Harrington and facing the man who looked exactly like Charles Stone, feeling utterly ill at ease. The banquet concluded as the afternoon wore on. Edward Harrington had been summoned by His Majesty for a private conversation, so she waited by Edward Harrington's ornate carriage. Lillian Moore held her lute beside her, accompanied by Henry Fletcher, Edward Harrington's personal guard. Inside the imperial study, His Majesty James Harrington, Prince Edward Harrington, and imperial concubine Elizabeth Harrington were gathered. Elizabeth Harrington spoke excitedly, "Your Majesty, the Duchess of Hao is nothing like my sister. My sister has been simple-minded since childhood, illiterate, unskilled in any art, timid, and afraid of trouble. She's so shy she barely speaks in front of others. While today's Duchess of Hao bears a slight resemblance to my sister, I can assure you, she is absolutely not my second sister. Your Majesty, you must investigate thoroughly, don't let her deceive you. My sister must have been harmed by her, you must seek justice for my poor sister." As she spoke, she pretended to wipe away tears, stealthily observing the reactions of James Harrington and Edward Harrington. In truth, Margaret Harrington's performance at the banquet had startled her, filling her with envy. But she was certain that the radiant woman could not be the timid, mouse-like Margaret Harrington who meekly accepted beatings and scoldings. Thus, she dared to accuse her before His Majesty, hoping misfortune would befall the woman who was 100 times more beautiful than herself. Listening to Elizabeth Harrington, James Harrington appeared dubious. Could that breathtaking woman truly be as weak and useless as rumored? Why would her own sister claim she wasn't Margaret Harrington? He looked up at his younger brother, observing him standing there, lips pressed together, his face expressionless. "Your Majesty, she is definitely not my sister, don't be fooled by her. What if she has ulterior motives, detrimental to House Harrington? Your Majesty, I am worried for the prince, you must consider this carefully." Seeing the brothers' silence, Elizabeth Harrington continued. The Emperor's face changed instantly. This was precisely his fear. Edward Harrington's expression also shifted. He looked coldly at the hypocritical woman before him and said, "This matter doesn't require the concubine's concern. I can handle one woman." Elizabeth Harrington's face fell, then quickly recovered as she said with a smile, "Your Highness, I am merely concerned for you, afraid you'll be deceived. Women like her are full of schemes, making it difficult for your Highness to be on guard." Seeing his brother's displeasure, James Harrington said, "Elizabeth, you may leave. No one is to speak of this matter." "Yes, your majesty," she replied, and though unwilling, she retreated, not daring to disobey. What do you make of Elizabeth Harrington's words? Who is she, really? After Elizabeth Harrington left, only the two brothers remained in the imperial study. The emperor hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Brother, you suspect she isn't Margaret Harrington?" Edward Harrington looked up at his older brother. "Yes," the emperor replied with a thoughtful nod. "According to Elizabeth Harrington, and our own investigations, Margaret Harrington was never favored at the Harrington estate, living a life worse than a servant's. She never received an education, let alone learn poetry or music. The way she saved Lance from drowning that day was astonishing, and today's Margaret is even more surprising. Not only did she compose 3 poems about chrysanthemums, each with profound meaning, but she also played the lute. Such masterful skill cannot be acquired overnight. Moreover, the song she sang isn't from our Windcloud Empire. The Margaret Harrington at the Harrington and the Margaret Harrington married to you are 2 different people. Don't you find it strange? Could she be a spy from another kingdom, married to you with ulterior motives? Brother, don't you worry about this, Margaret won't harm me. She once told me that when she was little, she saved a reclusive master who then took her as a disciple, teaching her all sorts of skills. All these years she's been at the Harrington, she's been biding her time, those rumors are all false." For some reason, even to his closest brother, Edward Harrington didn't want to reveal Margaret Harrington's true identity. Those secrets were best kept to himself. So, he naturally lied for Margaret Harrington. He hoped his brother wouldn't give her a hard time. "So, she is Margaret Harrington. Will that be detrimental to me?" "Yes." Edward Harrington nodded. "She didn't want to reveal herself, it was I who told her I wanted to reclaim the soul-chasing zither from the Moonlight Empire, that's why she showcased her talents. Don't worry, brother, she won't harm me. If that's truly the case, she is indeed an extraordinary woman." James Harrington exclaimed, then added, "She's willing to retrieve the zither for you, which shows you're in her heart. Treat her well, don't let her down. Women with both beauty and intelligence are rare." "Brother, I will." Edward Harrington lowered his head in reply, his heart heavy. Today, her display of talent, her beauty, her singing voice, had attracted the gazes of so many men. Even his imperial brother, would he be captivated by her too? And that Evan Gray. Looking at her with such a lascivious gaze, did he think Edward Harrington was dead? And that woman's attitude towards Evan Gray. His fists gradually clenched, a terrifyingly sinister light emanating from his eyes. That woman could only belong to him. No one could steal her away. And she wouldn't dare cuckold him. Mother is at the temple offering prayers to Buddha, she'll be back in a few days. If she isn't one of Mother's people, you must be careful, Mother might harm her. Looking at his younger brother's impassive face, James Harrington reminded him. "I won't let her harm her." Edward Harrington said resolutely, his face grim. Anything he ever cherished, his mother would ruthlessly destroy. His pain was her joy. He had never angered her, always enduring everything. But this time, she wouldn't dare harm her. He would protect her at all costs. He had to admit, when she played and sang, his heart was moved. He didn't know if this was love, but he wanted to protect her well, and hide her away from everyone's sight. "Miss, you were amazing today. Lillian Moore almost didn't recognize you." Beside the carriage, Lillian Moore approached Margaret Harrington, whispering excitedly, lowering her voice for fear of being overheard. "Miss, you have no idea how beautiful you were today, especially when you were singing, the wind blowing away your veil, you looked like a celestial fairy." Margaret Harrington said nothing, but gazed into the distance, lost in thought. Was she too obvious today? Reborn, she only wanted an ordinary, peaceful, simple life. That's why she agreed to marry Edward Harrington. It was just for stability, a life of mutual respect, nothing to do with love. But today, for a soul-chasing zither, she revealed too many secrets. She couldn't help but sing. How strange, she actually couldn't control herself. Obtaining this peerless instrument, yet attracting so much attention, was this a gain or a loss? And then there's Evan Gray, a man identical to Charles Stone. Just as she thought of this, a group of people approaching from afar caught her attention. Each person exuded an extraordinary aura, the leader dressed in black, with handsome features, radiating a wicked, arrogant air. It was the Moonlight Empire's entourage. The man in black was Crown Prince Evan Gray of the Moonlight Empire. She involuntarily looked at him, at the face identical to her beloved, her heart in turmoil. She didn't know how to face him, constantly warning herself to stay away, yet she couldn't resist looking at that face, even just for a moment. Soon, Evan Gray noticed her and her servant. A slight smile played on his lips, his wicked eyes fixed directly on Margaret Harrington. Catching his gaze, Margaret Harrington quickly lowered her head, her heart pounding uncontrollably. She wanted to escape, so she turned and walked towards the carriage, intending to climb inside. But the man in black wouldn't give her the chance to escape. "Does the Princess of How Manor look down on me? Why does the princess want to leave as soon as I arrive?" he asked, standing before her, raising an eyebrow. His burning gaze locked onto her, even through the veil, Margaret Harrington could feel it. "Your Highness jests," she replied, trying to suppress her emotions, her voice calm and indifferent. "If not, then good. I thought the princess didn't want to see me." He stared at her, his deep eyes gleaming with a dark light, his words laced with a meaning that made Margaret Harrington uneasy. "I congratulate the princess on obtaining the soul-chasing zither today. With beauty like a celestial being and overflowing talent, you are a worthy owner of the soul-chasing zither," he said courteously, with the proper demeanor of a gentleman. Only his eyes were somewhat gloomy. "The soul-chasing zither is a divine weapon, whoever masters it can destroy cities and armies, taking on a myriad of enemies. I advise the princess to be cautious when using it. Rest assured, Your Highness, I am but an ordinary person, only wanting to live a peaceful life. The affairs of the world have nothing to do with me. I obtained the soul-chasing zither purely out of fondness, nothing more. Your Highness can be at ease, the world will not be thrown into chaos because of this instrument. It's good that the princess thinks so. I bid you farewell." He smiled, politely excused himself, and departed. Margaret Harrington watched his retreating figure, her heart tangled like a ball of yarn. "Your Highness, should we kill her?" After walking some distance, a man beside Evan Gray asked respectfully. This man was in his 30s, with a sturdy build and a face as dark as coal, clearly a seasoned general. He was the top general under Crown Prince Evan Gray, General Trent Ray of the Moonlight Empire. Evan Gray paused, then continued walking. A moment later, he commanded authoritatively, "Do not touch her." "Yes, Your Highness," the man replied. In truth, finding a master for the soul-chasing zither was merely a pretext for their diplomatic mission. Their true objective was to assess the strength of the Windcloud Empire and the Sunburst Empire. They were certain no one could control the soul-chasing zither, and even if such a woman appeared, they would kill her without hesitation. No one could steal a treasure of the Moonlight Empire. Yet, he didn't want to kill this woman. He had never met a woman so unique. Her beauty was ethereal, capable of toppling kingdoms, yet she possessed a tranquil composure, elegant as a lotus, her refined aura like an orchid in a hidden valley, awakening within him feelings he thought long dormant. More accurately, he was intrigued by this rumored fool of a princess consort. She seemed to harbor many unknown secrets, beckoning him to explore. That such a beautiful woman belonged to the man he hated most fueled his desire even more. This woman, he must possess. Investigate this woman's background. The more detailed, the better, he commanded coldly. "Yes, Your Highness." Edward Harrington approached the carriage, witnessing a scene that made his blood boil. His face darkened, his entire being radiating a chilling aura like a 1,000-year-old glacier. His princess consort, the woman in the azure dress, her face hidden behind a thin veil, was gazing dreamily after the receding figures of the departing delegation. She was so engrossed that she didn't even notice his approach. And that delegation was none other than the emissaries from the Moonlight Empire. He sensed that her gaze was fixed on Evan Gray. His face grim, he strode forward, gripped Margaret Harrington's arm tightly, and pulled her into the carriage. Caught off guard by the sudden pull, she cried out in surprise, losing her balance. In an instant, she was dragged into the sky-blue carriage. Chapter 34, She once saved me. Startled, she looked up to meet his handsome but somber face, his angry roar echoing in her ears, back to the manor. She heard Henry Fletcher acknowledge the order outside, and the carriage lurched forward. Margaret Harrington obediently offered no resistance. Though puzzled, she knew this hot-tempered prince was enraged, and not lightly so. She didn't want to invite trouble. But even if he was angry, why drag her along? His grip was so tight, her arm felt like it would break. "You want to cuckold me?" Edward Harrington tightened his hold, his grim face close to hers, growling furiously. Margaret Harrington froze, then replied coldly, "Your Grace is paranoid." "Paranoid?" He laughed coldly, as if hearing a joke, then his sharp eyes glared at her furiously. "Do you think I'm a fool, blind to everything? Speak. What is your relationship with Evan Gray?" Hearing the name Evan Gray, Margaret Harrington's heart ached, a chill running through her. She retorted icily, "I told you, I don't know him. Believe it or not, it's up to you. You don't know him, yet you stared at him, entranced. Don't tell me it was love at first sight with that damned man." He sneered coldly. Margaret Harrington's anger flared. "Edward Harrington, you're being unreasonable." She struggled against his grip, regardless of his fury. But his hold was too strong. "Let go," she yelled. "Good. Very good. This woman dared to defy him. What a bold woman." Edward Harrington's face paled, his heart burning with rage. His grip on her arm intensified, her struggles futile. His furious gaze fixed on her face, hidden behind the veil. He suddenly recalled her playing the zither in the great hall, a gust of wind revealing her ethereal, breathtaking beauty, and his heart stirred. He abruptly ripped away the hindering veil. Margaret Harrington, still lucid, cried out, "Let go. This is inside the carriage." She hadn't forgotten they were on their way back to the manor, the road bustling with people outside. Her eyes flicked to the soul-hunting zither, wrapped in red silk, in the corner of the carriage. At this moment, she felt fortunate to have retrieved it. "Your Grace, Your Highness, we've arrived at the manor." Margaret Harrington silently sighed in relief. Finally. But she didn't expect the fleeting relief in her eyes to be caught by Edward Harrington. He sneered, rising from her and straightening his clothes. Margaret Harrington slumped against the carriage floor, panting, warily watching him. What a hypocrite. Her clothes were disheveled, while he was perfectly composed, not a hair out of place. Once composed, Edward Harrington glanced at Margaret Harrington, still lying on the floor, a wicked smile playing on his lips. "What's wrong, my princess? Waiting for my favor?" Margaret Harrington's lips twitched, speechless. Edward Harrington retrieved his black cloak from the corner, draping it over her, covering her completely. "Hey, what are you doing?" Margaret Harrington exclaimed angrily, but kept her voice low to avoid being overheard. She irritably reached up to pull back the cloak. "Don't move." He scooped her up, the cloak concealing her entirely. "If you don't want others to see you like this, be still." Margaret Harrington immediately fell silent. Her hair was a mess, she truly couldn't be seen like this. He carried her out of the carriage, instructing Henry Fletcher to bring the soul-hunting zither to the study, then proceeded directly into the manor. The servants who greeted them, seeing the dark bundle in the prince's arms, were curious but dared not stare, only stealing glances. They wondered, was that the princess? Upon entering the manor, Edward Harrington went straight to the bedroom, whispering in Margaret Harrington's ear, "Don't be impatient, my beloved." Margaret Harrington shuddered, nearly falling from his arms. Her teeth gritted. If her clothes weren't in such disarray, she would have fought him right then and there. Sensing Margaret Harrington's reaction, Edward Harrington's mood lifted. The anger stirred by her and Evan Gray had inexplicably dissipated. The man behind her breathed evenly, likely sound asleep from exhaustion. Margaret Harrington was also exhausted but couldn't sleep, staring into the dark night. Past events replayed in her mind like a film, and she felt like an outsider, her heart strangely calm. Suddenly, a warm presence pressed against her back, an arm encircling her waist. Margaret Harrington stiffened, unsure when he had woken, then relaxed. "Why aren't you asleep?" His husky voice, gentle in the quiet night, surprised her. He had never spoken to her like this. "I can't sleep," she replied softly. He pulled her closer, murmuring, "You're tired. Sleep." Her cheek against his warm, firm chest, Margaret Harrington blushed, saying, "Edward Harrington, you once saved me, remember?" "Saved you?" Edward Harrington frowned, thinking for a moment, but to no avail. "When?" He had completely forgotten. "A few days before our wedding. That night, I was kidnapped by a thief, being assaulted, when you came and saved me, killing him. I remember it was by the river," she recounted, lost in thought. She wasn't usually talkative, but tonight she felt the need to confide in someone. Perhaps it was from being alone for so long, she thought. Hearing about her kidnapping, Edward Harrington felt a pang of worry, but when she mentioned him saving her, he was confused. Thinking carefully, he vaguely recalled such an incident. He had met with his mother that day, feeling troubled, and had gone to the Cloudwater River bank at night for some solace. He hadn't expected to be disturbed, so he had killed the thief who called himself Skyborn Butterfly. He hadn't paid much attention, so naturally, he had quickly forgotten. "Are you the brave woman who asked for my life, saying you wanted to repay me?" he asked. He still had a slight impression of that courageous and calm woman, though he hadn't seen her face clearly. "Yes. But you were cold, ignoring me in leaving." Recalling that night, Margaret Harrington couldn't help but complain. "Cold?" Edward Harrington was surprised. What did she mean? "Oh, like ice. That day, you were like a large block of ice, so cold that I could feel it even from a distance," Margaret Harrington explained. Edward Harrington's face darkened, unseen by Margaret Harrington. This woman was truly audacious, daring to call him cold. But he felt fortunate that he had intervened that day, he couldn't imagine what might have become of her otherwise. Tightening his embrace, he teased, "You said you wanted to repay me, so you repaid me with your body?" "No. I didn't know you were him until you lifted my veil. But you didn't recognize me." "Oh, then I was wrong." He readily apologized, then, remembering something, asked, "Why were you outside so late that night?" "I was running away," Margaret Harrington replied calmly, oblivious to the sudden gloom that descended upon the man behind her. "You didn't want to marry me?" Edward Harrington asked, controlling his emotions. He knew she was a unique woman, not easily opened up to anyone. Tonight's conversation was an exception, and he couldn't afford to disrupt this atmosphere, knowing such an opportunity might not come again. "Of course. Back then, I was new here, everything was unfamiliar. The Harrington family treated me terribly, always bullying me, and forcing me to marry. So I ran away, and unexpectedly encountered such a situation. Fortunately, you met me, otherwise, you would have been in dire straits." Edward Harrington felt fortunate that he had gone out that day, then asked, "Margaret, where do you come from?" What is it like there? That place. Margaret Harrington thought for a moment, then said, it's called China. It's very beautiful, with advanced technology, bustling traffic, and everyone working and striving to live. But even the most beautiful places have their shadows, and she was someone who lived in those shadows. China? I've never heard of it. He frowned. Of course you haven't. Its history doesn't mention your Windcloud Empire. Perhaps they are parallel worlds, but the technology there is 1,000 years ahead of this place. Parallel worlds? He had never heard that term before. That's terminology from my time, you wouldn't understand. Is the song you sang during the day from there? It was very beautiful, he asked. Yes. Are you also a talented woman there? Able to write such beautiful poetry, he exclaimed. This time, Margaret Harrington felt a pang of guilt, saying, actually, I don't know how to write poetry at all. People there don't write poetry. Even if they did, it wouldn't be like this. Oh. Then those poems. I stole them. They are all poems from ancient times. I've been able to read since I was young, Margaret Harrington continued. So that's how it is. Edward Harrington couldn't help but laugh. He hadn't expected the talented woman who amazed everyone to be like this. You said Evan Gray's face was very familiar. Is there someone exactly like him in your world? Finally asking the question he most wanted to know, his mood couldn't help but become heavy. Yes. Hearing this name, her heart couldn't help but tremble, and after a long while, she softly replied. Are you very familiar with that person? Yes. What is your relationship with him? Finally, Edward Harrington couldn't help but ask. Your Highness, I'm tired and want to sleep. After a long silence, Margaret Harrington spoke, her voice cold and distant, completely devoid of the comfort and gentleness from just a moment ago. She slipped out of his embrace, pulled the blanket, and lay far away from him. Edward Harrington's face darkened, very dissatisfied with her reaction. She had just called him Edward Harrington, which he found very comfortable. Now she had changed back to Your Highness, clearly creating distance. Was it because he mentioned Evan Gray? He wanted to get angry, but in the end, he held back, irritably rolling over in the blankets. He knew she had a past, otherwise, she wouldn't always look pensively towards the horizon. But he absolutely didn't want her to have any connection to Evan Gray. He knew he couldn't force her at this moment, otherwise, it would only push her further away. He could naturally control thousands of troops and horses, but in his heart, he wasn't sure he could control her. Although she had always appeared weak and gentle since their marriage, with his sharp eyes, he could see that she was definitely not an ordinary woman he could control. Staring at her slender back for a long time, when he thought she had fallen asleep, her voice suddenly rang out. Your Highness, the past is over. I've decided to forget it, so don't ask again. That Evan Gray, I, more than anyone, don't want to see him. In the darkness, Edward Harrington quietly smiled with satisfaction. He hoped so. Hashtag chapter 35, the tri-word primer hashtag chapter 36, coincidence hashtag chapter 37, jealousy, Your Highness, please behave yourself. Margaret Harrington said, slightly flustered. Heh, could it be that the princess has no feelings for me at all? Why do I feel like the princess is always sneaking glances at me? Evan Gray looked at Margaret Harrington, smiling mischievously. Margaret Harrington stiffened, coldly saying, Your Highness is mistaken. Her face couldn't help but flush. There was no other way, facing a face identical to the one she loved, she could never remain calm. Is that so? Evan Gray slowly said, his low, magnetic voice echoing in the small space, fermenting into an unusual atmosphere. Evan Gray stood up, walked to Margaret Harrington's side, and sat down. Margaret Harrington froze, not moving a muscle, but her heart pounded fiercely. So beautiful, even disguised as a man, you're breathtakingly beautiful." Evan Gray reached out and touched her face, whispering his praise in her ear. Margaret Harrington sat still, closing her eyes, feeling his hot hand caress her face. The hand inside her sleeve unconsciously clenched. Suddenly, a warm sensation spread across her earlobe, a hot breath brushed against her ear, itchy and numb, causing Margaret Harrington to tremble. Then came the low, seductive voice, "Beauty, I want you." Margaret Harrington fell into his arms, her eyes closed, her lips trembling slightly, the hand in her sleeve white-knuckled from clenching. Margaret Harrington suddenly opened her eyes, pushing the man beside her away, followed by a sharp slap. 5 fingerprints were clearly imprinted on the man's fair cheek. Evan Gray was stunned. He looked incredulously at the woman who had slapped him. Margaret Harrington stood up, her demeanor completely transformed, now terrifyingly somber. Her fairy-like face was now cold and gloomy, her clear, bright eyes now deep and bottomless, shooting out icy, emotionless glares. At this moment, those eyes stared at him, cold as if wanting to devour him alive. In this moment, she was the phantom wraith. Evan Gray, a crown prince, had seen countless people, yet he was terrified by the woman before him, his eyes unable to meet her icy gaze. He didn't understand how a woman as beautiful as a fairy could transform into a demon from hell in the blink of an eye. The icy, hellish aura radiating from her entire being, her gloomy, merciless eyes, made his legs weak. Margaret Harrington stared at him for a long time, finally uttering 2 cold words, "Bastard." Then she turned and left. Evan Gray's legs went weak, and he almost collapsed. Pushing the door open, Margaret Harrington ran straight out, paying no attention to her surroundings. On the stairs, she passed by 3 people. She didn't notice them, but the man in the lead stopped because of her. He turned and watched her retreating figure. As Margaret Harrington descended the stairs, a small figure rushed towards her. "Young Master!" Lillian Moore called out excitedly. Margaret Harrington raised her head, her gloomy eyes fixed on her. "Moss." "Master," Lillian Moore cowered under her gaze, stammering. She had never seen such a terrifying young lady, her eyes seemed to want to kill. Looking at the trembling maid before her, Margaret Harrington suddenly came to her senses, the terrifying gloom gradually receded, replaced by her usual coldness. "Lillian Moore, let's go," she said coldly, then walked towards the door. "Oh." After a moment, Lillian Moore reacted and hurriedly followed. She must have been mistaken just now, to see the young lady so terrifying. She was just a little cold. The man on the stairs watched the 2 leave, a hint of doubt in his eyes. "Phone, what's wrong?" The man in white beside him patted his shoulder and asked. "No. I must have seen wrong." He shook his head and went upstairs. Why did he feel that the small man just now was so familiar, but he couldn't remember where he had met him? How strange. Passing by a room, he glanced inside through the slightly open door, and the man stopped immediately. Inside the room, a man in black was holding onto a table, standing in a daze. His handsome face was towards the door, but he didn't react to the man's gaze. In that instant, the man knew who the person was just now. He turned and ran downstairs. "Hey! Phone, where are you going?" the man in white called out, but saw that the person had disappeared at the door. Out of the tavern, Margaret Harrington walked slowly down the street, Lillian Moore carefully following behind. Looking up at the bustling crowd, all kinds of busy people, Margaret Harrington sighed. Just now, she seemed to have suddenly understood a lot of things. Walking forward, a flash of blue suddenly appeared before her eyes, and a figure stood in front of her. Looking at the person who suddenly appeared, Margaret Harrington didn't react immediately. She saw the person in front of her grab her shoulders and fiercely shout, "Who did you just meet? Have you forgotten what I said?" Looking at the angry face in front of her, Margaret Harrington remained silent. Lillian more timidly hid behind Margaret Harrington, not daring to come out. "Speak!" he roared, glaring at her fiercely. The loud shout made the surrounding people stop and look at them curiously. A man in white squeezed through the crowd and called out, "Chow, what are you doing?" he said as he removed the hands tightly gripping her shoulders. A man dressed as a guard accompanying the man in white hurriedly dispersed the surrounding people. The angry man regained some reason, let go of his hands, but still glared at Margaret Harrington. Margaret Harrington remained silent, her expression unchanged. "My goodness, Chow, what are you doing? How can you bully someone in the middle of the street? Did this young brother provoke you?" The man in white looked reproachfully at the other man. "Dr. Mason, no more drinks today, I'll treat you another day. I'll take my leave first." The man still angrily said a sentence, then pulled Margaret Harrington away. The black-clad guard and Lillian Moore hurriedly followed behind. Only the bewildered man in white was left standing there. The man dragged Margaret Harrington back to the front of the tavern and pushed her into the luxurious blue carriage parked there. Then he jumped in himself. Once inside the carriage, the tall man pressed Margaret Harrington against the wall of the carriage and fiercely kissed her red lips, biting and tearing at them, with a force that wanted to seize everything. It wasn't until Margaret Harrington's lips were swollen and red that the domineering kiss ended. "Speak. Why did you meet Evan Gray?" he still angrily questioned. "Your Grace, are you jealous?" Margaret Harrington calmly asked, her clear eyes looking into his, as if trying to see through his heart. The man froze, his face slightly distorted. After a long while, he suddenly let go of her and shouted, "Jealous? Me, jealous? How could that be? It's good that you're not." Margaret Harrington lowered her eyelashes and whispered, as if sighing. Edward Harrington was momentarily at a loss. "Have you ever loved someone?" Margaret Harrington softly asked, her eyes on Edward Harrington, but her gaze seemed to fall into the distance, as if sinking into memories. Edward Harrington didn't know how to answer, surprised by her question, then he heard Margaret Harrington's low, melancholic voice echo in the carriage. "Loving someone, willing to live for him, die for him, only greedy for his warmth, hoping to see his warm, sun-like smile. To be with him, she's willing to sacrifice everything." But, Margaret Harrington paused for a moment, then continued, "One day, she suddenly discovers that the person she loves isn't him at all, she loves only an illusion. What he's really like, she doesn't understand at all." Margaret Harrington closed her eyes, her face seemingly expressionless, but Edward Harrington could sense her heavy heart. All the anger in his heart dissipated, leaving only confusion and an unspeakable bitterness. Margaret Harrington closed her eyes, a complex, uncomfortable feeling churning within her. The moment Evan Gray kissed her, she realized her perception of Charles Stone had been utterly wrong. From their first meeting, Charles Stone had been the perfect gentleman, attentive and kind, without a single flaw. He'd showered her with care and affection, his face always bearing a warm, sun-like smile. He'd never raised his voice, patiently tolerating all her shortcomings. Such a perfect man, like the Prince Charming of her dreams, had made her fall hopelessly in love. But now, looking back, she saw the cracks. He was human, a man of flesh and blood. How could anyone be so perfect, so devoid of temper, so utterly devoted to one woman? It's easy to paint a tiger's skin, but hard to paint its bones. It's easy to know a man's face, but hard to know his heart. Until now, beyond his gentle kindness, she knew nothing of his true nature. And that very gentleness, it turned out, was merely a tool to lull her into a false sense of security. The image she tried to suppress flashed repeatedly in her mind. The cold, grim face as he plunged the dagger into her chest, the icy, indifferent gaze in his eyes, it hadn't been a hallucination. That was his true face. For revenge, he'd lurked in the shadows beside his father's killer for a year, making his enemy fall deeply in love with him. Such a venomous heart, how could it possibly possess gentle kindness? It turned out that all this time, she'd loved only a phantom. Opening her eyes, she met Edward Harrington's worried gaze. Her heart trembled as she spoke, "Your Highness, don't be too good to me, and don't love me." Edward Harrington's eyes flickered. "Why?" "Because, my heart is already dead." Edward Harrington was stunned, staring at her in disbelief. What is love in this world, that it makes people live and die for each other? True love must endure countless hardships to bear fruit. But before I could taste that fruit, I was already wounded, exhausted in body and spirit. I once pursued it, thought I had the best, but it was all just a fleeting dream. Now that I've awakened, nothing remains. Edward Harrington was speechless, hearing her words. In her eyes, he saw despair, sorrow, and a world-weariness beyond her years. In this moment, he realized that her clear, water-like eyes weren't a sign of naivete, but of having endured so much that she no longer cared. "We are not from the same world. You cannot imagine what I've been through. So, Your Highness, don't fall for me, it's not worth it." Margaret Harrington looked at him, speaking earnestly. She wasn't a fool, she could sense the shift in his demeanor towards her these past few days, the affection hidden in his eyes. But her heart was too wounded to reciprocate. It was best for both of them if he let go of his feelings for her. Yet, his next words were so unexpected, they made her want to laugh and cry at the same time. "How old are you?" he asked, staring at her intently, a bewildered expression on his face. Looking at the bewildered, dumbfounded expression of the usually arrogant assassin king, Margaret Harrington couldn't help but chuckle. "Age? I'm much older than you. You're 20, and I'm more than 10 years older." Seeing Edward Harrington's face contort in astonishment, Margaret Harrington laughed heartily. "Marrying you? I'd be like an old cow grazing on young grass." Yes, she was 31. In this era, her son would already be married. Marrying such a young man would indeed be like an old cow grazing on young grass. This was the first time Edward Harrington had seen Margaret Harrington smile at him. Before, she'd always been cold, her face an icy mask. Only with the little crown prince, Lance Harrington, did she occasionally offer a faint smile. Now, she was smiling at him, a breathtakingly beautiful smile that melted the ice and cleared the clouds, capturing the beauty of a lifetime, captivating the world. Edward Harrington was mesmerized, feeling this smile seep into his bones, blend into his blood, and dissolve into his soul. But when he fully grasped the teasing nature of her words, he immediately bristled. "Old cow grazing on young grass. Humph." He protested indignantly, lunging forward to pin her against the carriage wall, his lips capturing hers in a domineering kiss. Only when they were both breathless did he release her, but not entirely. He pulled her close, holding her tight, burying his face in her soft, black hair. Margaret Harrington let him hold her, offering no resistance. But inwardly, she was puzzled by his actions. Chapter 38, I will protect her. Chapter 39, a cup of tea, a listen tale. Margaret Harrington, observing him, understood his concern for her and felt a touch of warmth, deciding not to protest further. "Lord Harrington summoned me back to the manor today, likely about this matter, to confirm whether I am truly his daughter," she stated softly. "Indeed, that seems likely. Don't dwell on it." After their meal, Margaret Harrington, feeling restless, picked up a small book and reclined on the chaise lounge to read. However, Edward Harrington was not his usual self today. He remained in her room, showing no intention of leaving. "Your Highness, do you have nothing else to attend to?" After a considerable silence, Margaret Harrington finally inquired. Why hadn't he left yet? His presence made her deeply uneasy. "I do. Of course, I do." Contrary to her expectation, Edward Harrington's face lit up at her question. He rushed over and embraced her tightly, lowering his head to gently kiss her earlobe. His voice, low and seductive, whispered against her ear, "I want you." Margaret Harrington startled, pushing against him. But he was prepared, tightening his hold and pressing her down onto the chaise lounge. "Your Highness, don't you have a plethora of beauties at your beck and call? They all yearn for your attention. Why cling to me?" she said, exasperated. "None of them compare to my beautiful princess," he murmured, kissing her. "Besides, you are my princess, attending to me is your duty." "Your princess is Margaret Harrington, not me," she replied calmly. Edward Harrington's movements froze. He lifted his head, gazing directly into her eyes, his voice serious, "You are Margaret Harrington, my princess. Never say otherwise again." Margaret Harrington met his gaze with a placid expression, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. Her indifferent gaze irritated Edward Harrington. "Remember, you are mine, forever," he warned. Underscore 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 Margaret, let's sit in here for a while. On the bustling street, Edward Harrington, dressed in azure robes, stood before a tavern, turning to address the young man in green beside him. "All right," the young man agreed, a hint of reluctance in his expression. At his agreement, a flicker of joy crossed Edward Harrington's face, softening the sharp angles of his handsome features, imbuing them with a rare tenderness. He took the young man's hand and led him into the tavern. "Very well," the young man in green assented, a touch of reluctance in his demeanor. Edward Harrington's face brightened at the response. His handsome features softened, a rare gentleness gracing his expression. He took the young man's hand and led him into the tea house. Margaret Harrington was truly at a loss. She couldn't fathom why the esteemed Hao Wang of the Windcloud Empire had disregarded his pressing duties to escort her around the city. Furthermore, he hadn't brought a single guard or attendant, just the two of them. She wasn't fond of ostentation, but under his overwhelming presence, she could only comply, reluctantly, risking her life to accompany the gentleman. The capital city was indeed prosperous, bustling with commerce and vibrant entertainment districts. The tea house, situated in the heart of the city, enjoyed a prime location and thriving business. All 3 floors were packed with patrons. On the second floor, a small stage had been erected where a storyteller held the audience captive with his animated tale. Edward Harrington bypassed the second floor and escorted Margaret Harrington directly to the third, into a private room. From here, the view was superb, overlooking the activity below. A waiter respectfully presented hot tea, then quietly withdrew. "Do you frequent this establishment?" Margaret Harrington inquired, noting his familiarity with the place. Even the waiter seemed to recognize him. "Indeed. This place bustles with activity, a prime location for gathering information. Besides, the tea here is exceptional." He poured a cup of hot tea and placed it before her as he spoke. "I'm no connoisseur of tea," Margaret Harrington replied indifferently. "No matter, with experience comes appreciation." Edward Harrington spoke gently. "This is Ming Qian tea, harvested before the Qingming festival. The leaves are delicate and smooth, a vibrant green, with a refined fragrance and rich flavor. Its elegant appearance makes it a prized tea. Because Ming Qian tea grows slowly and yields a small harvest, there's a saying, Ming Qian tea, precious as gold. Try it, it's even more exquisite than Yu Qian tea." Margaret Harrington hadn't expected him to be so knowledgeable about tea. As he spoke, an air of refined elegance surrounded him, completely devoid of his usual chilling aura. This made her see him in a new light. Under his expectant gaze, she took a sip, slowly savoring the flavor. Indeed, a delicate, refined fragrance lingered in her mouth, long after the sip was gone. "Well?" His eyes, fixed on her, questioned. It's delicious, Margaret Harrington responded, then, avoiding his gentle gaze, she turned her attention to the scene below. Don't be so kind to me. I don't want to accept it. She thought, a surge of complex emotions rising within her. Seeing her averted gaze, a flicker of sadness crossed Edward Harrington's eyes, though his expression remained gentle. When will you open your heart and let me in? He truly didn't want to perpetually face her cold demeanor. Downstairs, the storyteller finished a tale, met with thunderous applause. The patrons roared in unison, "Tell us another. Tell us another story." The storyteller, a man in a grey robe, appeared to be in his 30s or 40s, with a ruddy complexion and a sharp, lively demeanor. Seeing the enthusiastic response, he announced loudly, "All right, I'll tell you another. Let's talk about the How Princess Consort of the Wind Cloud Empire, the one who obtained the soul-seeking zither." A wave of enthusiastic cheers erupted from below. Margaret Harrington looked at the storyteller in surprise, then glanced at Edward Harrington. He, coincidentally, was also looking at her, a gentle smile gracing his handsome features. Margaret Harrington quickly turned away, feeling her face flush. This prince truly shouldn't smile, he could make a whole crowd swoon. This How Princess Consort truly has a remarkable background. She is a legend of our Wind Cloud Empire. The storyteller sighed, his face filled with reverence. What is her background? Why do you call her a legend? Isn't she just the daughter of a lesser branch of the Harrington family? That's right, the crowd below buzzed with excited chatter, their curious gazes fixed on the storyteller. Upstairs, Margaret Harrington couldn't hide her astonishment. When did she become a legend of the Wind Cloud Empire? Don't rush, everyone, let me tell you the story slowly. The storyteller smiled, seemingly pleased with the attention they were receiving. This princess consort is no ordinary person. Everyone knows that her mother was a beauty like a celestial being, with a stunning appearance, a true national treasure. But fate was unkind, and she drifted into a brothel, becoming a renowned courtesan, captivating countless young gentlemen. Later, she was taken in as a concubine by Lord Harrington, the richest man in the capital, ending her life in the pleasure district. But sadly, she was a beauty with an ill-fated destiny, dying from complications during childbirth when giving birth to the princess consort. It's truly heartbreaking, the How Princess Consort lost her mother from birth, and her biological father, Lord Harrington, didn't care much for her, causing her to suffer much bitterness from a young age. Rumors outside say that the princess consort is illiterate, foolish, and timid, but in reality, those are just slanders, completely untrue. The mere fact that she survived without any support in the tumultuous Harrington estate is enough to prove she's no ordinary person. Moreover, she was betrothed by the Empress Dowager to the current emperor's royal kinsman, the renowned Lord Harrington of the Wind Cloud Empire. Think about it, everyone, if the princess consort were truly ordinary, would the Empress Dowager have bestowed such a marriage upon her? The storyteller's emotive voice made the crowd below nod in agreement. That's right, thinking about it carefully, it makes sense. Lord Harrington has so many wives and concubines and children, yet the How Princess Consort, without any backing, lived peacefully and was even betrothed by the Empress Dowager. This alone is a miracle. It proves that the How Princess Consort is extremely intelligent and capable. Someone in the crowd chimed in. Hearing this, the others began to ponder, then nodded in agreement, praising Margaret Harrington, saying that she was indeed extraordinary. Upstairs, Margaret Harrington turned to look at Edward Harrington, a complex emotion flickering in her eyes. The Empress Dowager marrying her off to him was meant to be his death sentence, yet the storyteller spun it into a testament to her exceptional talent. Talk about turning black into white. Edward Harrington looked at her tenderly, a captivating smile playing on his lips. This How Princess Consort is not the useless person as rumored. She is actually a gifted woman, proficient in all the arts. The storyteller continued. Moreover, the princess consort possesses a beauty like a celestial fairy, a national treasure, even surpassing her mother's beauty 100-fold. But because she trained in secret at the Harrington estate from a young age, she never revealed her appearance. It wasn't until she married Lord Harrington that her true beauty was unveiled. It's said that when she saved the crown prince and princess in the imperial palace, her breathtaking beauty captivated everyone in the palace. Both men and women were completely mesmerized. We've heard about it too. Those who witnessed the princess consort's beauty that day said she was a fairy descended from heaven. That's right, that's right. We know about this too. The crowd below responded in unison. A descended fairy? Your people are truly skilled weavers of tales. Margaret Harrington looked at Edward Harrington, speaking with a mixture of amusement and exasperation. In my eyes, you are a descended fairy. Edward Harrington sat beside her, drawing her into his embrace, his voice soft yet unwavering. Margaret Harrington leaned against his broad chest, silent, but her eyes reflected an indescribable anguish. She hailed not from the radiant celestial realm, but from the deep, dark abyss of hell. Isn't the princess consort of Harrington estate said to be unfavored? How then, can she be so proficient in the arts? Such things aren't acquired naturally. Suddenly, a voice from the crowd questioned. The esteemed guest is simply unaware. The storyteller smiled. The princess consort encountered a fortunate opportunity in her youth. It is said she possessed a kind heart and once aided a reclusive master. This master took her as a disciple, visiting the capital for several months each year to personally instruct her. Thus, the princess consort became widely learned and skilled, possessing exceptional techniques. It was through these that she easily obtained the world's treasure, the soul-seeking lute. This brought glory to our Windcloud Empire, making the Moonlight Empire no longer dare to underestimate the women of Windcloud Empire. It's said the princess consort was born in an inauspicious hour, month, and year, a purine woman with a deadly fate. Is this true? Another person inquired doubtfully. Esteemed guest, such words cannot be uttered carelessly, lest you invite misfortune upon yourself. The storyteller's face grew serious, his voice grave. In truth, those are mere rumors. Someone, envious of the princess consort obtaining the soul-seeking lute, deliberately spread false information to defame her. You shouldn't believe such things. So that's how it is. How despicable of the rumormonger. The crowd buzzed, many voices condemning the source of the rumors. The storyteller didn't name names, but every word subtly hinted at the Moonlight Empire's envoys. The listeners below weren't fools, they all understood the implication, yet none dared to speak it aloud. However, their admiration for Margaret Harrington grew, while their resentment towards the Moonlight Empire intensified. Was it them? Margaret Harrington turned to ask Edward Harrington. Yes, it was them. He nodded firmly. Margaret Harrington lowered her eyes, a bitter feeling rising within her. Indeed, he wasn't a kind man. He was worlds apart from the gentle man in her memories. Edward Harrington watched her intently, relieved to see no significant change in her expression. It said the princess consort's acquisition of the lute was a journey fraught with difficulties, truly astonishing. Tell us, tell us. A clear voice rang out from below. All right, allow this humble storyteller to recount this part for everyone. The story goes, let's go. Margaret Harrington spoke calmly. The purpose of this trip had been achieved, there was no need to stay any longer. She didn't want to hear more fabricated stories about herself, even if they were meant to protect her. All right. Edward Harrington replied, embracing her as they stood. Margaret Harrington remained silent, but a sense of gratitude for his protection welled up within her. Though she cared little for reputation, she didn't wish to be whispered about as a jinx or a woman who brought misfortune to her husband. Actually, I'm not a cursed lone star. The old monk said my fate has changed, it's not the same as before. Margaret Harrington murmured before stepping out the door. Huh? Edward Harrington froze, not understanding what she was saying. I said, I'm not a jinx, I won't bring you bad luck. She calmly repeated. Finally, Edward Harrington understood. His mood instantly brightened, a radiant smile spreading across his lips. Whether you're a cursed star or not doesn't matter to me. I don't care. But you explaining it now, could it be that you care about me? Care about you? With what eyes did you see that? Seeing his teasing gaze and suggestive smile, Margaret Harrington, both embarrassed and angry, broke free from his embrace and quickly walked out of the room. Damn it, what am I doing? Explaining it to him, even wanting to reassure him. I'm crazy. Hey, Mor, wait for me. Edward Harrington called after her, his voice brimming with smugness and joy. Hearing him call, Margaret Harrington's steps faltered, nearly causing her to stumble. This damned man, calling her Mor so intimately, so hateful, so horrible. It gives me goosebumps. ### Chapter 40, Stinky Tofu. Edward Harrington strode forward, embraced her, and chuckled, why are you walking so fast? Let's go together. Margaret Harrington was dressed in men's attire today. Amidst the bustling crowd, Edward Harrington's embrace of Margaret Harrington, with one tall and handsome and the other petite and refined, was quite eye-catching. The surrounding people all stared at them in surprise, their eyes gleaming. Margaret Harrington suddenly blushed, as if burned by fire. She struggled to break free from his embrace, but couldn't escape. Instead, she was grandly led out of the tea-house by Edward Harrington. Reaching the main street, Margaret Harrington forcefully pulled herself from his grasp and said, aren't you afraid that tomorrow the whole city will be gossiping about the wise and valiant Lord Harrington of the Windcloud Empire embracing a man in the street, implying he's a sodomite? He, Edward Harrington chuckled, let them gossip, I don't care. Besides, who would dare? Why hadn't she noticed his roguish nature before? She had thought he would forever be a 1,000-year-old block of ice, unable to laugh or cry. It seemed her ability to judge character had deteriorated significantly. Come on. You finally managed to get out, don't be angry anymore. I'll take you to see the bustling sights of the Windcloud Empire. Looking at her small, angry face, Edward Harrington finally stopped teasing and spoke seriously. Not interested, Margaret Harrington said coldly. Edward Harrington wasn't angered, but smiled and said, then consider it a way for this princess and I to unwind. A wife with her husband, it's only natural. Surely, Margaret won't refuse. Looking at the handsome yet roguish face before her, Margaret Harrington really wanted to throw a punch. But reason reminded her that this was absolutely impossible. She was no match for this prince. Seeing her silence, Edward Harrington smiled and said, let's go, and pulled her along. Edward Harrington dragged her through a series of shops, silk shops, cosmetic shops, jade shops, calligraphy and painting shops, entering every one he saw, even browsing a weapons shop. Margaret Harrington showed little interest, but Edward Harrington enjoyed himself immensely, buying a pile of things and instructing the shopkeepers to deliver them directly to Harrington Manor. He frightened the shopkeepers out of their wits. Tired from buying so much, Edward Harrington stopped entering shops and strolled leisurely along the street with Margaret Harrington. Margaret Harrington remained quiet, only observing while he shopped, and only giving non-committal responses when he asked for her opinion. She seemed to have no interest in shopping whatsoever. While walking, Margaret Harrington would glance at the small items displayed along the road, occasionally showing a flicker of interest and pausing to look. Edward Harrington didn't bother her, just stood beside her. As they walked, a pungent odor suddenly assaulted their noses, a peculiar mix of stench and fragrance. Margaret Harrington stopped, staring blankly ahead. Ahead was a small stall with a large pot, where golden tofu pieces were sizzling. 4 or 5 people stood before the stall, waiting for the tofu to be ready. An old man, around 56 years old, busily scooped the fried tofu pieces from the pot, skewering them one by one with bamboo sticks, brushing them with salt, soy sauce, chili oil, sesame oil, and handing them to the waiting customers. Customers took their skewers of stinky tofu and left satisfied. The familiar pungent aroma brought Margaret Harrington's thoughts back to the past. Through the chaotic flow of time, she seemed to see a 6-year-old girl with 2 braided pigtails, holding a skewer of stinky tofu, standing anxiously before a stinky tofu stall, looking left and right, waiting for her mother. But even as the hot tofu in her hand grew cold, the woman she waited for never appeared. In the years that followed, countless times in her midnight dreams, she dreamt of her younger self finally meeting her mother and eating the delicious, spicy, and fragrant stinky tofu. Together. Smelling the pungent odor, Edward Harrington wrinkled his nose in displeasure and was about to pull Margaret Harrington away. But seeing her staring at the stinky tofu stall ahead, her expression complex and her gaze distant, as if seeing distant memories through it, he called out, "Margaret." But she didn't react, her eyes still fixed on the stinky tofu stall. Edward Harrington looked at the stall ahead, then back at Margaret Harrington beside him. He quickly walked to the stall, threw down some silver pieces, and snatched a skewer of stinky tofu that the old man had just finished preparing. "Margaret, here you go," he called out, waving the skewer in front of her. The pungent aroma filled her nostrils, and Margaret Harrington snapped out of her reverie. Seeing the stinky tofu skewer waving before her eyes, she was slightly stunned, looking at Edward Harrington in confusion. Edward Harrington smiled and said, "I heard the stinky tofu here is delicious, it smells bad but tastes good. Try it." Margaret Harrington silently looked at him, and after a long moment, reached out to take the stinky tofu skewer, not even realizing her hand was trembling slightly. Edward Harrington stood still, a smile playing on his lips as he watched her. Holding the bamboo skewer, feeling the real sensation in her hand, smelling the characteristic scent of stinky tofu, her eyes suddenly welled up, her heart strangely softened. "Margaret, what's wrong?" Seeing the tears welling up in Margaret Harrington's eyes, Edward Harrington panicked and asked anxiously. Margaret Harrington looked up at the man before her, his face full of concern, and suddenly threw herself into his arms, hugging him tightly. Her reaction stunned Edward Harrington. Margaret, a mixture of surprise and joy left him speechless. In the end, he just hugged her slender form tightly. "Thank you." After a long while, Margaret Harrington's choked voice came from his embrace, as if suppressing sobs. Edward Harrington froze, then held her even tighter. A moment later, Margaret Harrington pulled away from his embrace, her face regaining its composure, but different from the previous coldness, now seemingly with a bit more vitality. Margaret Harrington looked at the hot stinky tofu skewer in her hand and took a bite. The stinky tofu was fragrant and crispy, soft but not mushy, refreshing and delicious, bringing a relaxed smile to her face. She looked at Edward Harrington and smiled, "It's really delicious, do you want a bite?" This was the first time Edward Harrington had seen such a smile from Margaret Harrington, without mockery, without reluctance, a smile like a satisfied child. The smile came from the bottom of her heart, making her whole being radiate gentle light, so bright that it was impossible to look away. Edward Harrington gazed at her beautiful face, his heart filled with unprecedented joy. He looked at the stinky tofu skewer offered to him and took a bite. Like a child, he chewed vigorously and said, "Delicious, delicious, it's really delicious." In truth, he had no idea what the thing in his mouth tasted like. At this moment, even if she had offered him poison, he would have praised its taste. Margaret Harrington looked at him, smiling sweetly. Finally, someone was eating hot stinky tofu with her, she didn't have to wait anymore. Since that day out on the town, the people of Harrington Manor clearly felt that their prince had changed. Although he still maintained his usual expressionless face, he rarely got angry. Sometimes, when his subordinates made mistakes, he didn't punish them as mercilessly as before. The maids and guards in the manor no longer trembled in fear when facing the prince alone. This was indeed a significant change. Everyone in the manor believed that all the changes in the prince were thanks to the breathtakingly beautiful but cold and reticent princess in the falling lotus pavilion. The fact that the prince had been visiting the Falling Lotus Pavilion continuously these past few days showed that it was the princess who had caused his perpetually icy face to show signs of thawing. Moreover, now the entire Wind Cloud Empire was rumored to be saying that the princess was a celestial fairy descended from heaven, so they had changed their previous disdainful attitude towards this princess and treated her with great respect. That afternoon, Margaret Harrington was practicing the zither in the Falling Lotus Pavilion, with Edward Harrington sitting beside her, listening with interest. Suddenly, Steward Fu rushed in and said, Your Highness, the Crown Prince of the Moonlight Empire requests an audience outside the manor. Margaret Harrington's zither playing abruptly stopped, causing Edward Harrington to frown and look at her. Her face, however, remained calm, betraying no emotion. This irritated him greatly. Standing up to leave, Edward Harrington instructed, Invite him to the main hall. Her fingers rested on the zither strings, but Margaret Harrington's heart was far from calm. Although she knew that this Moonlight Empire Prince Evan Grey wasn't Charles Stone, and Charles Stone wasn't her destined one, hearing his name and thinking of the face she once loved so deeply still brought a pang of sorrow to her heart. Recalling their accidental encounter and his inappropriate advances, she couldn't help but feel disgusted. The Moonlight Empire envoy had been in the Wind Cloud Empire for half a month. Why hadn't he left yet? What was his purpose in visiting Harrington Manor? At the third watch, Margaret Harrington had just finished bathing and lay down when Edward Harrington entered. He said nothing, pulling her close and attempting to kiss her red lips. Don't, I'm tired tonight. Margaret Harrington stopped his descending lips, refusing him. Edward Harrington looked at her for a long time before giving up the kiss, lying down beside her, and closing his eyes. Margaret Harrington secretly breathed a sigh of relief. She thought he would disregard her wishes. It was just that he seemed unhappy tonight. Was it because of Evan Grey? The Moonlight Empire Prince came to bid farewell today. They will depart for their country in 3 days. After a long while, as Margaret Harrington was drifting off to sleep, Edward Harrington's voice suddenly rang out, startling her. Her drowsiness instantly vanished. Oh, she finally uttered after a long pause. She didn't understand why he was telling her this. He came to see you today. Edward Harrington suddenly raised his voice, turning over and staring at her with deep black eyes. Margaret Harrington opened her eyes and looked at him without speaking. She could hear the anger in Edward Harrington's voice, but she didn't understand why Evan Grey would want to see her. Could it be that the unpleasant encounter that day wasn't enough for him? Edward Harrington stroked her smooth face and slowly said, He said that he and you felt like old friends at first sight, and now that he's leaving, he came to visit you. Like old friends at first sight? Margaret Harrington sneered inwardly. She did indeed feel like she knew him at first sight, but it was that face she felt she knew. Like old friends at first sight. When was that? Was it when you robbed the lute player, or was it at the Xing Long Tavern? He asked slowly, his voice deep and unreadable, his calloused hand still lingering on her smooth face. For some reason, Margaret Harrington suddenly felt a fire ignite within her, impossible to suppress. She brushed away his wandering hand and said coldly, If your Highness wants to hear something, just say it directly. I don't understand this roundabout talk. Edward Harrington also spoke coldly, narrowing his long, narrow eyes, and said, Does the princess consort think she shouldn't give this king an explanation? Explanation. Margaret Harrington looked at him coldly and said, Why should I explain to you? Or does your Highness think that I have an affair with the Moonlight Empire Prince, cuckolding you? You! Edward Harrington was so angry he was fuming, wanting to punch her, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. He just wanted an explanation. Was that too much to ask as her husband? So why was she so fierce and intimidating? If I told your Highness that Evan Grey looks exactly like the man I loved in my past life, would your Highness believe me? Margaret Harrington stared at his face, a bone-chillingly cold smile playing on her lips. She said coldly, I don't believe it. Edward Harrington immediately replied, but in his heart, he did believe it. He still remembered the way she looked at Evan Gray, infatuated, pained, as if they had known each other for 1,000 years. He also remembered her telling him that she was 31 years old this year, an age where she would certainly have been married with children. Was the man Evan Gray resembled her husband? The thought sent a sharp pang of pain through his heart. But he didn't want to admit it, preferring to believe that she had never loved anyone, never married anyone, and was only his, Edward Harrington's, princess consort. Slightly surprised by his answer, Margaret Harrington glanced at him, then turned over, her back to him. She didn't like talking about the past, didn't like mentioning Charles Stone, wanting to bury them in the millennium past. Why did he have to bring it up, suspecting her of having a relationship with Evan Gray? How could she not be angry? She had told him everything about her past, and had told him more than once that she would absolutely not have anything to do with the Moonlight Empire prince, yet he still doubted her. Could it be that his caring and protective treatment of her these past few days was all fake? Her heart was in turmoil. Closing her eyes, Charles Stone's gentle, smiling face and Edward Harrington's cold, handsome face alternately appeared in her mind, making her slightly dizzy. Edward. Harrington stared at Margaret Harrington's thin shoulders, his heart also in turmoil. Her indifferent expression just now was exactly the same as when they first met. He wanted to open her heart, and had made some progress in the past few days, but it seemed that his reckless actions today had ruined everything. He regretted it slightly. He didn't want to make her angry. But Evan Gray's words today had truly angered him. He said that he and she had a very pleasant conversation, and even called her his soulmate. How could he not be angry? He really wanted to hold her in his arms like before and sleep together. But he was afraid that her rejection would trample on his pride without mercy. For her, he no longer recognized himself. He had never thought that one day he would try so hard to please a woman, and even willingly do so. He had never known he could be so tolerant of a woman, that even though she had someone else in her heart, he still chose to turn a blind eye. He, Lord Harrington, who held the power of the Windcloud Empire, could also be so weak. Chapter 41, Farewell in the Shadows. He watched her back for a long time, restless and unable to sleep. Only when he heard her even breathing did he know she was asleep. He gently shifted, carefully pulling her into his arms. The dreaming woman, upon touching his warm body, instinctively clung to him, burying her face in his chest. Unconsciously, her lips murmured, "Charles Stone. Charles Stone, don't go." Edward Harrington's body stiffened momentarily, then he tenderly tightened his hold on the woman in his arms. Charles Stone, this name, she had called it more than once in her dreams. When would she be able to forget that man and turn her heart completely to him? A sharp pain stabbed at his heart. A pain far greater than the hundreds of times his mother had hurt him. Today was the day the Moonlight Empire's envoy left the capital. Since early morning, Margaret Harrington had been restless. She wanted to see that face one last time, yet she loathed Evan Gray's improper behavior and worried that Edward Harrington's jealousy would turn him cold towards her. Alas, she didn't know when she had started caring about Edward Harrington's attitude. Could it be that this cold man had begun to enter her heart? She had told herself not to love again, so what place did Edward Harrington ultimately hold in her heart? She instinctively avoided the question. She simply told herself that he was her support in this world, the guarantor of her long life. She went to the harp, her fingers resting on the strings, but she had no desire to play. Enough, she wouldn't torment herself anymore. It would be better to leave the manor and stroll around for a bit. On the bustling street, a figure in pale blue particularly attracted attention. She wore a pale blue dress, her slender figure radiating a noble, cold, and unapproachable aura. A blue cloak draped over her shoulders, enveloping her delicate form, fluttering in the winter wind, adding to her ethereal presence. Passers-by couldn't help but cast curious glances her way, only to be disappointed to find her face hidden behind a thin, hazy veil, making it impossible to see clearly. But just by looking at her tall figure, one could guess that she possessed a breathtakingly beautiful face. Margaret Harrington walked down the street, Lillian Moore by her side. She wore a blue conical hat, its brim lowered to conceal her face. She hadn't wanted to wear the veil, but Edward Harrington had once seriously requested that she wear it when leaving the manor. After some thought, she decided it was best not to defy the cold and ruthless prince of the Windcloud Empire, so she obediently put it on. Besides, his concern was valid, her stunning beauty was best seen by few. One thing she found strange was why Edward Harrington's clothes were all blue, even hers, the princess consort's, were also blue, pale blue, dark blue, azure blue, all shades of blue. She had once asked him, and he said he liked blue, the blue of the sky, and the blue of the sea, tolerant, vast, and tranquil.